hand still shakes sometimes when I think about all the conversations I translated, all the messages I helped people understand when they couldn't communicate with each other directly. I'm in a youth hostel in Durham at the moment. Strange choice for someone my age. But they don't ask many questions, and you can pay by the week if you help with the cleaning. There's a Polish girl working here who keeps trying to practice her English with me, and every time she asks me to help her with a difficult phrase, I feel physically sick, because translation work used to be how I made my living. I was a freelance interpreter for nearly 20 years, mostly doing remote work for businesses that needed help with European languages, especially Polish and Romanian. Then, the agency I worked through lost most of their contracts to cheaper overseas services, and I had to find other clients quickly. That's when I started taking translation jobs from people who wouldn't use mainstream services. People who needed communications interpreted that they couldn't risk going through official channels. I've had plenty of time these past few weeks to think about what I was really translating, what those carefully worded messages were actually arranging, and who was being hurt by the conversations I helped facilitate. I'd built up a good reputation over the years as a reliable interpreter. Nothing glamorous, mostly technical documents, business correspondence, the occasional video conference where participants needed real-time translation. The work was steady and paid well enough that I could afford a decent flat in Durham and didn't have to worry too much about money. The collapse happened gradually. First, a few regular clients stopped renewing their contracts. Then the agency reduced their rates to compete with overseas services. Then finally, they let most of their UK-based interpreters go in favor of cheaper options abroad. I was 52 years old, with language skills that were suddenly worth half what they'd been the previous year. I spent several months taking whatever translation work I could find at increasingly desperate rates. Technical manuals that paid pennies per word, tourist guides that barely covered my rent, even some transcription work that didn't require my language skills at all. I was watching my savings disappear and wondering how much longer I could afford to stay in my flat. That's when I got the message through a freelancer website. Someone needed an experienced Polish-English interpreter for ongoing communication work that required absolute discretion. The rate they offered was exceptional, about 3 times what I'd been earning before the agency collapsed. They emphasized they needed someone reliable who could work with sensitive material and maintain strict confidentiality about the content of translations. The client, who identified himself as Mr. Walsh, explained during our initial phone conversation that he coordinated communications for business people who operated in areas where privacy was essential. Many of his clients conducted transactions that required confidentiality, and they needed interpreters who understood the importance of discretion and wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about what was being discussed. I should have questioned what kind of business required such secretive translation services, should have wondered why legitimate companies wouldn't just use standard interpretation agencies. But Mr. Walsh was offering rates I couldn't afford to refuse, and I convinced myself that lots of businesses dealt with sensitive information that required privacy. The first assignment was straightforward enough. I was given a text message conversation between 2 people discussing what appeared to be a commercial transaction. One participant wrote in Polish, the other in English, and I provided real-time translations so they could communicate effectively. The conversation involved negotiating prices and delivery arrangements for unnamed goods, with both parties being careful to avoid specific details about what was being bought and sold. The vague language made me uncomfortable, but I told myself I was just facilitating communication, not endorsing whatever transaction they were arranging. My role was technical, providing accurate translation so people could understand each other, not moral or legal judgment about their business activities. Mr. Walsh was pleased with my work and immediately sent me more assignments. Over the following weeks, I translated dozens of conversations between Polish speakers and English speakers, all discussing commercial arrangements in deliberately vague language, quantities, prices, delivery schedules, but never specific details about what goods or services were actually being exchanged. The work fell into a comfortable routine. I'd receive notifications about new conversations that needed translation, provide real-time interpretation as messages appeared, and collect payment for the hours I'd worked. The money was keeping me financially stable for the first time since the agency had collapsed. But I started noticing elements of the conversations that troubled me. Some discussions included references to people rather than goods, talking about availability and suitability in ways that suggested they were arranging some sort of service rather than product delivery. Others mentioned timing that needed to coordinate with school schedules or work shifts, details that seemed unnecessarily specific for standard commercial transactions. When I raised concerns about the nature of what I was translating, Mr. Walsh explained that privacy-conscious businesses often used coded language to protect confidential information from potential competitors or regulatory oversight. My role was to translate the words accurately, not to interpret the underlying business purposes those words served. That rationalization let me continue accepting assignments without examining too closely what I was really facilitating. I was just an interpreter, providing technical translation services without responsibility for how parties used their ability to communicate with each other. The assignments became more disturbing over time. I found myself translating conversations that discussed people's routines, their vulnerabilities, their living situations. Discussions about the best approaches for making contact, techniques for establishing trust, even advice about circumventing security or supervision. I was translating what were obviously criminal conversations, but always with enough ambiguity that I could tell myself I didn't really understand the full context. Maybe these were private investigators conducting legitimate surveillance. Maybe they were security consultants testing vulnerabilities. Maybe there were innocent explanations I wasn't aware of. The breakthrough came when I translated a conversation that included a specific address in Durham. Two people were discussing someone who lived there when they'd be home alone, the best approach for gaining entry to the property. The Polish speaker was providing detailed instructions about security arrangements and optimal timing, while the English speaker confirmed they understood and would proceed as discussed. I recognized the address immediately. It was my neighbor's flat, just 2 doors down from where I lived. An elderly Polish woman who I'd occasionally help with her shopping or paperwork that required English comprehension. Someone had been surveilling her property and was now coordinating with an English speaker to exploit whatever they discovered about her vulnerabilities. I realized I'd been translating communications between criminals who were planning burglaries, harassment, possibly worse crimes against specific individuals. The deliberately vague language wasn't protecting legitimate business confidentiality. It was helping criminals coordinate their activities while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. I thought about all the other conversations I'd translated over the past few months, all the careful arrangements I'd helped people make about timing, approaches, vulnerabilities. Each translation I'd provided had probably enabled crimes against people who had no idea they were being discussed by strangers planning to victimize them. But what made it unbearable was understanding that my translation skills had been essential to these crimes. The Polish and English speakers couldn't communicate effectively without my interpretation, couldn't coordinate their criminal activities without someone bridging their language barrier. And I'd been that bridge making it all possible through professional translation services. I tried warning my neighbor about the planned crime without revealing how I knew about it, but she didn't speak enough English to fully understand my concerns, and I didn't speak enough Polish to explain the specifics. The communication barrier that had made me valuable as a translator also prevented me from adequately warning the very person my translation work was targeting. 2 days later, her flat was burgled while she was visiting friends. The thieves had known exactly when she'd be gone and had targeted specific items she'd mentioned in conversations I'd translated months earlier. She'd been discussing her valuables with relatives in Poland, never knowing that someone was intercepting those conversations and using an interpreter to understand what she was saying. That's when I realized the full scope of what I'd been part of. I wasn't just translating conversations between criminals coordinating their activities. I was translating private communications between innocent people and their families, helping criminals understand conversations that were never meant for anyone else to hear. I started investigating the technical aspects of how I received translation assignments, trying to understand how Mr. Walsh was obtaining these conversations. What I discovered was that I was working with people who intercepted private communications between Polish speakers and their families or friends, then used interpreters like me to understand what was being discussed so they could identify opportunities for exploitation. The victims weren't willingly participating in conversations with criminals. They were having private discussions that were being secretly monitored and translated to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Someone discussing their work schedule with family members might find themselves burgled during those specific hours. Someone mentioning health problems might be targeted by people offering fake medical services or financial assistance. I found records of hundreds of conversations I'd translated over the past few months, all between Polish speakers discussing their personal lives with people they trusted, family conversations about daily routines, friends discussing concerns about security, elderly people talking with relatives about their health or finances, all intercepted and translated to identify people who could be targeted for various types of exploitation. Some conversations I translated had led to burglaries like the one targeting my neighbor. Others had enabled harassment campaigns against people who discussed fears or vulnerabilities with loved ones. A few had facilitated worse crimes that used intimate knowledge of people's lives obtained through intercepted and translated private conversations. But what disturbed me most was discovering that my translations weren't just enabling individual crimes. They were being sold to multiple people through hidden marketplaces, where criminals purchased intelligence about potential targets. The conversations I translated would be packaged with my interpretations and sold to anyone interested in targeting Polish speakers in specific areas or with particular vulnerabilities. I found marketplace listings offering translated intercepts organized by location, age group, and vulnerability type. My careful translations were presented as professional intelligence products that enabled efficient targeting of people who had no idea their private conversations had been compromised. One listing offered a package of translations I'd done involving elderly Polish women living alone in the Northeast, complete with my interpretations of their routines, health situations, and valuable possessions they'd mentioned to family members. Another focused on Polish families with young children, selling translated conversations that revealed school schedules, childcare arrangements, and times when children might be unsupervised. I was looking at evidence that my translation work had enabled systematic exploitation of vulnerable people, and that my professional skills had been weaponized to turn private conversations into commercial intelligence products sold to criminals. The worst part was understanding that the victims would never know how they'd been targeted. They'd been having private conversations in their native language, discussions they believed were secure because most people in the UK couldn't understand Polish. But I'd eliminated that security by providing professional translation services that made their private lives accessible to anyone willing to pay for the intelligence. My neighbor had been speaking Polish with her family members about the jewelry she'd inherited, never imagining that someone was translating those conversations to identify her as a burglary target. Other people I'd unwittingly helped victimize had discussed their fears, their routines, their vulnerabilities in Polish, believing they were safe because their conversations weren't in English. I'd destroyed that safety by providing the translation bridge that made their private lives understandable to criminals who treated non-English communications as an untapped resource for identifying potential targets. I tried contacting the police about what I'd discovered, but explaining my role without admitting extensive complicity proved impossible. I'd been translating intercepted communications for months. Accepting substantial payment for work I should have recognized wasn't legitimate. The translations I'd provided had enabled serious crimes against real people. The officer I spoke to was professional but frank. I'd knowingly worked with people intercepting private communications, providing translation services that enabled criminal activity. The fact that I claimed not to have fully understood what I was doing wouldn't protect me from prosecution for my role in systematic exploitation of vulnerable people. I was advised to stop translating immediately and refuse further contact with Mr. Walsh, but he'd already anticipated that possibility. I started receiving messages in Polish, obviously using a different interpreter now, warning me that people who cause problems would face serious consequences. The messages included details from my own private conversations, things I'd discussed with family and friends that I'd assumed were secure. They'd turned their interception and translation services on me, demonstrating that I was just as vulnerable as all the people whose conversations I'd been translating. Then I found my own details listed in the marketplace where they sold translated intercepts. Someone had packaged information about my life, my routines, my vulnerabilities, all obtained through monitoring and translating my private communications. I was now a product in the same marketplace I'd been supplying with translations. That's when I left Durham entirely, abandoning my flat and most of my possessions to hide in this youth hostel where nobody knows my background or understands why someone my age is staying in budget accommodation meant for backpackers. But I know the interception and translation services continue without me. Other interpreters have probably been recruited to translate intercepted Polish communications. People who'll make the same rationalizations I did about just providing technical language services without responsibility for how their translations are used. The marketplace is probably still selling translated intercepts to criminals who use them to target vulnerable people. And somewhere in those listings, translations I provided months ago are probably still being purchased and used to enable crimes against people whose only mistake was having private conversations in a language they thought would protect them. I keep thinking about my neighbor, about all the other people whose private conversations I translated without understanding I was betraying their trust and security. They'd been speaking Polish, believing it gave them privacy, never knowing that professional interpreters were being paid to eliminate that protection and make their private lives accessible to anyone willing to pay for the intelligence. The translation work taught me that language barriers can create false security, that speaking in your native language doesn't protect you if someone's willing to hire interpreters to understand what you're saying, that professional translation skills become weapons when applied to intercepted private communications, and that once you've spent months translating conversations you should have recognized weren't meant for you to interpret, you become too compromised to report it without facing prosecution for your role in enabling systematic exploitation. I suppose that's why I'm hiding in this youth hostel, rather than helping police shut down the interception and translation operation. Because I know my translations are documented evidence of my active participation in crimes against vulnerable people. And I'm not brave enough to face consequences for choices I made when professional satisfaction and financial need mattered more than questioning what my skills were really being used for. All I can do is hope that someone else will eventually expose these operations, that other interpreters will find courage I lack to report what they're translating despite personal cost, and hope that people whose private conversations I translated managed to stay safe despite the intelligence I helped create about their lives. Because the operations are still running, still recruiting interpreters, still intercepting private communications and selling translated intelligence to criminals. And I helped prove that professional translation services make interception more valuable, helped establish that non-English communications are exploitable resources, helped create an industry that treats people's private conversations as raw materials for criminal intelligence products. I just wish I could undo it all, could warn every person whose conversations I translated, could restore the security they thought they had when speaking in their native language. But I can't, so I just avoid the Polish girl who works here and try not to think about how my professional skills were weaponized against people who trusted that speaking Polish would keep their private lives private. Isn't it strange how sometimes the thing that gets you banned from everywhere respectable is exactly what prepares you for places where respectability would just make you a target? I was 24 and living in a bedsit in Newcastle when I got permanently banned from the last mainstream poker platform that would accept UK players. Not for cheating, I wasn't good enough at the game to cheat successfully, but for what they politely called persistent antisocial behavior in chat rooms. Turns out that calling other players idiots when they made obviously stupid moves violated community standards, even when you were demonstrably correct about their lack of skill. After about 18 months of warnings and temporary suspensions, they decided I was too disruptive for their family-friendly environment. The problem was that I'd gotten addicted to the thrill of high-stakes games against players who thought they were cleverer than they actually were. Losing access to legitimate platforms meant either giving up poker entirely or finding alternatives that operated outside normal regulatory frameworks. The dark web had plenty of gambling sites that didn't care about your previous behavior on mainstream platforms. Anonymous rooms where you could play against people from around the world without worrying about identity verification or community standards. The sort of places that attracted players who'd been banned elsewhere or preferred to keep their activities private. I started with straightforward poker rooms that functioned exactly like legitimate sites except for the lack of regulation and player protection. The games were often higher quality than mainstream platforms because everyone there was serious about gambling rather than just casual entertainment. But the anonymous nature of these sites meant they attracted more than just poker players. People shared information about other hidden services, discussed activities that wouldn't be tolerated on the regular internet, treated the whole dark web like a private club for people who didn't fit into conventional online spaces. After about 6 months of regular play, I started hearing about rooms that offered more than just card games. Places where you could bet on real events happening in real time, often with the ability to influence outcomes through collective audience participation. The concept seemed like a natural evolution of online gambling. Instead of betting on the outcome of artificial games with predetermined odds, you could wager on genuine events with unpredictable results. The sort of authentic uncertainty that serious gamblers were always seeking. One player I'd gotten to know through regular games mentioned that he'd accessed rooms where you could watch and bet on what he called live action streams. Events broadcast from various locations where viewers could place bets on outcomes while they were happening. He was deliberately vague about the specific nature of these events, but his description suggested they were considerably more intense than typical sports betting or casino games. The sort of content that would explain why they needed to operate through hidden services rather than legitimate platforms. After proving my reliability through months of regular poker play, he offered to share access details for one of these live-action rooms. He warned me that the content might be disturbing for people who weren't prepared for genuine uncertainty and real consequences. I should have asked more questions about what exactly I'd be watching and betting on. But the thrill of accessing something exclusive and potentially profitable overrode my caution about getting involved in activities I didn't fully understand. The access process was similar to the poker rooms I'd been using, just with additional security measures that suggested the content was more sensitive than card games. When I finally connected to the live-action room, the interface was more sophisticated than anything I'd encountered before. Multiple video feeds showed different locations, each with associated betting options and viewer participation features. The quality was professional rather than amateur, suggesting serious investment in equipment and infrastructure. Most of the feeds showed empty rooms or static scenes, but one was obviously active with something happening in real time. A basement or converted garage space with someone strapped to a metal table in the center of the frame. The betting options were unlike anything I'd seen before. Not simple win-lose propositions, but complex wagers on specific outcomes, duration of events, audience participation effects, the sort of sophisticated gambling mechanics that would appeal to serious players rather than casual observers. I placed a small bet on the duration of the current event, thinking I was wagering on some kind of performance or staged competition. The other participants in the room seemed experienced, placing larger bets with the confidence of people who understood what they were watching. About 30 minutes into my observation, someone entered the video frame and began making preparations that made it clear this wasn't a performance or competition. This was real violence happening in real time, with an audience betting on specific aspects of what was going to occur. I should have left the room immediately and tried to forget what I'd seen, but the gambling mechanics were genuinely engaging, and I found myself placing additional bets despite being disturbed by the content I was watching. The other participants treated it like any other form of gambling, discussing odds and strategies with the clinical detachment of professional players. Their casual approach to extremely disturbing content was somehow more unsettling than the violence itself. Over the next few weeks, I found myself returning to the live-action rooms regularly, not because I enjoyed watching violence, but because the gambling was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Genuine uncertainty combined with immediate results and the ability to influence outcomes through betting patterns. The rooms hosted different types of events on different schedules, all involving real people in real situations with unpredictable outcomes. The production quality varied, but the gambling mechanics were consistently sophisticated and engaging. What bothered me most wasn't the violence itself, but the gradual realization that some events appeared to be happening locally rather than in distant foreign countries. Background details that suggested British locations, architectural features I recognized, even glimpses of packaging or signage that looked familiar. I started paying attention to local news reports, looking for incidents that might correspond to events I'd seen in the live-action rooms. Without specific dates or clear geographic indicators, it was impossible to make definitive connections. but there seemed to be more unexplained incidents than you'd normally expect. One case particularly caught my attention because it involved someone who'd gone missing from Newcastle, not far from where I lived. They disappeared after leaving a pub in the city centre, and despite extensive searches, no trace had been found. The physical description and age matched someone I thought I'd seen in one of the live streams, though the poor video quality made it impossible to be completely certain. But the timing and circumstances were consistent enough to be disturbing. The possibility that people from my own area might be involved in the events I'd been betting on made everything feel more immediate and dangerous. This wasn't abstract gambling on distant events. It could be involving people who lived in my city, used the same pubs, walked the same streets. I considered reporting what I'd discovered to the police, but I knew how that conversation would sound. Former poker player claims to have found evidence of live violence streams while gambling on illegal platforms. They'd probably assume I was making up stories to deflect attention from my own illegal gambling activities. More importantly, I was worried about what might happen if the people running these rooms discovered that someone was connecting their content to real-world events. I'd been participating regularly for weeks, placing bets and contributing to room discussions in ways that could potentially be traced back to me. I decided to be more cautious about which rooms I accessed and how much personal information I revealed through my betting patterns. But I also found myself unable to stop participating entirely, partly because of the gambling addiction, but also because I'd become fascinated by the mechanics of how these rooms functioned. The betting systems were remarkably sophisticated, suggesting serious technical expertise and financial investment. The video quality was professional, the streaming was reliable, and the audience participation features worked flawlessly, despite the obviously illegal nature of the content. Someone was running what amounted to a high-tech gambling business based on real violence, with all the infrastructure and technical sophistication you'd expect from legitimate online casinos. The sort of professional activity that required significant resources and long-term planning. About 2 months after I'd started accessing the live-action rooms, I received a private message from someone who claimed to be interested in my betting patterns and analytical approach to the events. They said they'd noticed my consistent participation and wondered if I might be interested in additional opportunities that weren't available to casual participants. More exclusive rooms with higher stakes and more sophisticated gambling mechanics. The offer felt like a natural progression from regular participation to VIP access, the sort of reward system that legitimate gambling sites used to retain valuable customers. But something about the tone of the message made me uncomfortable. It suggested they'd been monitoring my activities more closely than I'd realized, tracking not just my bets, but my overall approach to the content. The level of surveillance implied either sophisticated technical capabilities or dedicated human observers. I didn't respond immediately, telling myself I needed time to consider whether I wanted to become more deeply involved in activities that were obviously illegal and potentially dangerous. But I kept checking for new messages, worried that not responding quickly enough might be interpreted as rejection or disrespect by people who demonstrated they had access to considerable resources and weren't constrained by normal legal boundaries. The next evening, I found an envelope that had been slipped under my door while I was out buying groceries. Inside was a single piece of paper with information that made my hands shake as I read it. It was a printout of my betting history from the live action rooms, showing not just the amounts I'd wagered, but detailed analysis of my patterns, preferences, and successful predictions. Information that should have been private, but had obviously been compiled by someone with complete access to the room's records. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note. with a simple message. We should meet. No signature, no contact details. Just those 3 words that made it clear someone wanted to discuss my participation in person, rather than through anonymous online messages. The note was accompanied by an address in Newcastle city centre and a time the following evening. A location I recognized as a legitimate business area, rather than anywhere obviously dangerous or suspicious. I spent the rest of the evening trying to decide whether to attend the meeting or disappear entirely from the dark web gambling scene. Either choice felt risky. Meeting unknown people who demonstrated extensive surveillance capabilities, or refusing contact with individuals who clearly had significant resources and few legal constraints. In the end, curiosity and concern about the consequences of non-compliance made me decide to attend the meeting. But I also made arrangements to have someone check on me if I didn't return home by a specific time. The meeting location was a coffee shop in a busy part of the city centre, the sort of public space where nothing obviously threatening could happen without witnesses. I arrived early and positioned myself where I could observe the entrance while appearing to read a newspaper. The person who approached my table looked completely ordinary. Mid-30s, well-dressed, the sort of professional you might see in any business district. Nothing that would make them stand out in a crowd or suggest involvement in illegal activities. They sat down without introduction and began discussing my participation in the live-action rooms with the casual familiarity of someone reviewing performance metrics with a valued employee. My betting patterns, analytical skills, ability to predict outcomes that other participants missed. The conversation felt like a job interview disguised as social interaction. They were evaluating my suitability for something more involved than passive participation, though they remained vague about what exactly that involvement would entail. After about 20 minutes of discussion, they made an offer that confirmed my worst suspicions about how deep I'd gotten into something I didn't understand. They wanted me to help select participants for future events. Not directly involved in violence, they assured me, just providing input about which types of people would create the most engaging content for gambling audiences. My analytical skills and understanding of what made events unpredictable would be valuable for improving the quality of their streams. The offer was presented as a natural progression from successful gambling to behind-the-scenes involvement, with financial compensation that was considerably more attractive than my current benefits and part-time work income. I told them I needed time to consider the opportunity, hoping to end the conversation without committing to anything, while also avoiding outright rejection that might have immediate consequences. They seemed to accept this response, mentioning that they understood such decisions required careful consideration. But they also made it clear that my previous participation had already made me part of their community in ways that couldn't be easily undone. As they left, they handed me a mobile phone and explained that they'd be in touch about my decision within the next few days. The phone was for communication purposes only and shouldn't be used for any other activities. I took the phone home and spent the evening trying to process what had just happened. My casual gambling on illegal platforms had somehow evolved into recruitment for activities that went far beyond passive participation in online betting. The phone remained silent for 2 days, during which I convinced myself that maybe they decided to pursue other candidates and I could return to normal life without further complications. Then it rang. The voice was different from the person I'd met, but the message was clear. They'd selected a potential participant for an upcoming event and wanted my input about whether this person would create engaging content for their audience. They provided an address and asked me to observe the location for a few hours, noting daily routines and habits that might be relevant for planning purposes. Nothing directly harmful, they assured me. Just gathering information that would help them make better decisions about content development. I should have thrown the phone away and moved to a different city immediately. Should have contacted the police despite the risks, to myself, and tried to prevent whatever they were planning. Instead, I found myself walking past the address they'd provided, observing someone who looked like they could have been me in different circumstances. Someone living alone, following predictable routines, vulnerable in ways they probably didn't even realize. I never reported back about what I'd observed, and I never answered the phone when it rang again over the following weeks. But I also never threw it away or tried to escape the situation entirely. Because part of me knew that people who went to such lengths to recruit assistance wouldn't simply accept non-cooperation as a final answer. And another part of me was curious about how far this could go, how much control they really had, whether someone like me could find a way to benefit from association with people who clearly had resources and opportunities that weren't available through legitimate channels. The phone is still in my flat, charged and waiting. Sometimes I think about what would happen if I answered it, what they might offer now that enough time has passed for them to assume I've had adequate opportunity to consider their proposition. But mostly I think about the person I observed and whether they're still following the same routine I documented, still unaware that someone has been watching them with professional interest. It's funny how sometimes the thing you think will make you feel less alone ends up making you wish you'd stayed isolated. But by then, it's too late to go back to not knowing what you know. I was 19 and in my second year studying English literature at a university in Leeds, when I stumbled into the chat room that changed everything. Not literally stumbled. I'd been looking for somewhere to belong for months, trying different online communities and forums where I might find people who shared my interests without the awkwardness of face-to-face interaction. College hadn't turned out the way I'd imagined. The other students on my course seemed effortlessly confident, forming friendship groups within the first week, while I struggled to contribute to conversations about books I'd read but couldn't discuss with the casual intelligence they all seemed to possess naturally. I spent most evenings in my tiny student flat, reading for seminars and browsing the internet for distraction. Social media felt performative and hollow, but smaller online communities seemed more genuine. Places where people discussed literature, philosophy, and ideas that were too complex or controversial for mainstream platforms. The invitation to the private chat room came through someone I'd been talking to on a forum about banned books. They'd noticed my posts about censorship and literature that existed in legal grey areas and suggested I might be interested in a more exclusive discussion group. The chat room was small, maybe 15 regular participants, and focused on what they called authentic, extreme content. Not fictional horror or theatrical violence, but real documentation of events that mainstream media wouldn't show. Academic discussion of material that revealed truths about human nature that most people preferred to ignore. For the first time since starting university, I felt like I was part of something intellectually stimulating. The other participants were clearly well-educated and thoughtful, approaching disturbing content with the sort of analytical framework you'd expect from graduate students or academics. They discussed everything from leaked investigation footage to underground documentaries that had never seen official release. The conversations were sophisticated, focused on technical analysis and historical context rather than sensation-seeking. I felt privileged to be included in discussions that demonstrated a level of critical thinking I rarely encountered elsewhere. Most importantly, I felt accepted. When I contributed observations about content they'd shared, people responded thoughtfully rather than dismissively. When I asked questions about things I didn't understand, they provided detailed explanations without making me feel ignorant. After about a month of regular participation, one of the more experienced members mentioned something that made me pay closer attention to what we were actually discussing. Red rooms. He brought them up casually, as if they were just another category of extreme content that serious researchers occasionally encountered. Live streams broadcast from hidden locations where viewers could watch real violence happening in real time. Most participants seemed to accept their existence as established fact, rather than urban legend. They discussed technical aspects of hosting such content, legal barriers to maintaining streaming services, and ethical questions about documentation versus participation. I'd heard of red rooms before, but always assumed they were internet mythology. Too technically complex and legally risky for anyone to actually maintain. But the way these people discussed them suggested genuine familiarity rather than theoretical speculation. One participant, who went by the username Observer, claimed to have archived material from what appeared to be genuine Red Room streams. He was selective about sharing evidence, requiring people to demonstrate serious research interest rather than casual curiosity. I spent several weeks proving my commitment to academic analysis of extreme content, sharing thoughtful observations about material others had posted, and asking questions that showed I was thinking critically rather than just seeking sensational material. Observer eventually shared some clips from his collection. Dark rooms with industrial equipment, bound figures, interface elements suggesting live streaming capabilities. The quality was poor enough that it could have been elaborate fiction, but detailed enough to be potentially genuine. What struck me as possibly authentic was the mundane elements that would be easy to overlook if you were creating hoaxes. Background sounds that suggested specific environments, equipment visible in shots, timestamps that corresponded to real dates and times. Observer explained that accessing live Red Room streams required more than just knowing where to look. The hidden services changed locations frequently and weren't something you could find through casual browsing of the dark web. But if I was genuinely interested in documenting whether red rooms were real phenomena or elaborate fiction, he could potentially arrange for me to observe a live stream that was scheduled for the following week. I should have declined at that point. My interest in extreme content was supposed to be academic, focused on understanding censorship and documentation, rather than witnessing actual crimes. But the opportunity to access something that most people believed didn't exist felt like the sort of exclusive knowledge that would cement my place in this community. The access process was more complex than anything I'd encountered before. Specific software downloads, rotating access codes, designated connection times that had to be followed precisely. The whole system felt designed to exclude casual browsers while providing access to serious researchers. When I finally connected to the stream, the interface was surprisingly basic. A video player showing a feed from what appeared to be a converted basement space, with a simple chat function below where viewers could communicate. The video showed a concrete-walled room with harsh lighting and minimal furniture. In the center was a metal table, and strapped to that table was a man who appeared to be in his 30s. He was conscious, but not moving much, occasionally testing his restraints or looking around the room with obvious confusion. The chat was active with comments from maybe 50 viewers, people discussing what they expected to see happen, making observations about the setup, treating the situation like academic analysis rather than entertainment. The tone was clinical and detached, which somehow made it more disturbing than if people had been obviously excited about violence. I watched for about an hour while supposedly working on an essay about censorship in contemporary literature. The man on the table would periodically struggle against his restraints or attempt to speak, but no audio was coming through the stream. Around 11 p.m., someone entered the frame. They were dressed in ordinary work clothes, jeans, plain shirt, boots that looked like they'd seen regular use. Nothing theatrical about their appearance, no mask or costume. Just someone who could have been starting any manual job, except for what they were obviously planning to do. The figure moved around methodically, arranging tools on a nearby surface, adjusting camera angles, checking equipment that wasn't visible in the main feed. They worked with practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first time following this routine. The chat became more analytical as preparations continued. People were discussing technical aspects of the setup, comparing what they were seeing to previous streams, making observations about the location and equipment being used. About 20 minutes into the preparations, I noticed something that made me look more carefully at the background details visible in the stream. On the wall behind the table was a small notice board with various papers pinned to it. Most were too far away to read clearly, but one appeared to be a health and safety poster with text that looked familiar. I paused the stream and looked more closely at the poster. The formatting and language were definitely British rather than foreign, and the specific wording seemed like something I'd seen before in university buildings or public spaces, which meant this stream was potentially being broadcast from somewhere in the UK rather than some distant foreign location. The realization made everything feel more immediate and dangerous. This wasn't abstract criminal activity happening somewhere else. It could be occurring within the same country where I was sitting in my student flat, possibly even in the same region. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessively researching British health and safety regulations, trying to identify the specific poster I'd seen and determine whether it might indicate a particular type of building or location. I also started paying attention to local news reports, looking for missing person cases that might correspond to victims I'd seen in streams. Without clear physical descriptions or specific dates, it was impossible to make definitive connections, but there seemed to be more unexplained disappearances than you'd normally expect. One case particularly disturbed me because the missing person was a student from a university not far from Leeds. They'd been reported missing about 6 weeks earlier after failing to return to their accommodation following a routine trip to the library. I researched the case more thoroughly and found that the missing student had been studying a subject similar to mine, lived in comparable accommodation, and followed daily routines that weren't that different from my own. The sort of person who could have been me if circumstances had been slightly different. The possibility that someone my own age with a similar lifestyle might have become a victim in the streams I'd been watching made everything feel personal in ways I hadn't expected. This wasn't just about academic analysis of extreme content. It was about real people suffering for reasons I didn't understand. I considered reporting what I'd discovered to the police, but I knew how that conversation would sound. University student claims to have found evidence of live murder streams while participating in online discussions about extreme content. They'd probably assume I was having mental health issues or making up stories for attention. More importantly, I was worried about what might happen if the people behind the streams discovered that someone had identified potentially incriminating details. I'd been accessing their content and participating in related discussions for weeks, possibly leaving digital traces that could be used to identify me. Observer had mentioned that accessing hidden content required understanding how to protect your identity from people who might not appreciate unwanted attention. Knowledge I clearly didn't possess. despite having been granted access to material that was obviously intended for a select audience. I decided to be more cautious about what I accessed and how I participated in chatroom discussions. But I also found myself unable to stop thinking about what I'd seen and whether there were more victims who hadn't been reported missing yet. The chatroom discussions continued as normal, with participants sharing new material and analyzing content with the same academic detachment they'd always displayed. But I started noticing details I'd missed before, references to local events, knowledge about British institutions, familiarity with UK geography and culture. The people I'd been chatting with weren't distant foreign academics studying extreme content from a safe distance. They were British, possibly even local to my area, with genuine knowledge about events that were happening in my own country. One evening, about 2 weeks after accessing the livestream, I received a private message from Observer asking whether I'd found the recent content educational and if I was interested in accessing additional material. His tone was friendly, but felt more personal than previous communications, as if he knew something about my response to what I'd seen that he hadn't mentioned in our public discussions. I replied cautiously, saying that I'd found the material academically interesting, but disturbing on a personal level. I tried to sound thoughtful rather than frightened, hoping to maintain my place in the community while expressing some reservations about the content. His response came back within minutes, which suggested he'd been online waiting for my reply rather than just checking messages occasionally. He said he understood my concerns but reminded me that serious academic study sometimes required confronting uncomfortable realities. He offered to provide access to additional streams that would help me develop a more comprehensive understanding of the subject. Something about the way he phrased the offer made me uncomfortable, as if my participation was expected rather than voluntary, and declining might have consequences I wouldn't like. I didn't reply immediately, telling myself I needed time to think about whether I wanted to continue accessing such disturbing content, but I kept checking for new messages, worried that not responding quickly enough might be interpreted as rejection or disrespect. The next morning, I found that I'd been removed from the chat room, not just blocked or suspended, but completely eliminated from the participant list. When I tried to reconnect using the original access method, I found that my credentials no longer worked, and there was no way to regain entry. I checked other platforms where I'd occasionally communicated with chat room members, but found that all my contacts had either deleted their accounts or were no longer responding to messages. Within 24 hours, every trace of my connection to the chat room and its participants had been severed, as if someone had systematically removed all evidence of my involvement. The sudden exclusion felt ominous rather than disappointing. Either I'd failed some test I hadn't known I was taking, or someone had decided that my continued participation represented a risk they weren't willing to accept. I tried to convince myself that being excluded was actually fortunate, a way out of a situation I'd gotten into without fully understanding the implications. But I couldn't shake the feeling that people who went to such lengths to maintain secrecy might take additional steps to ensure former participants didn't become problems. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small things that individually meant nothing, but collectively made me uncomfortable. Posts delivered at unusual times, items in my flat that seemed to have been moved slightly, sounds in the corridor outside my door that could have been coincidence, but felt like surveillance. One evening, I found an envelope that had been slipped under my door while I was at the university library. Inside was a single photograph that made my stomach drop as I looked at it. The photograph showed me walking across campus, taken from a concealed position that suggested professional surveillance rather than casual observation. Someone had been watching me closely enough to document my daily routine without me noticing anything unusual. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten message that made the situation clear. Some discussions are meant to stay private. No signature, no return address. Just those words that made it obvious someone knew about my previous participation in the chat room and wanted to ensure my continued silence about what I'd seen. I threw the photograph away and tried to convince myself it was a scare tactic designed to prevent me from reporting what I'd discovered. But I couldn't explain how someone had obtained detailed knowledge of my movements or managed to deliver the message without being noticed. Over the next few days, I became increasingly paranoid about being watched. Every stranger on campus felt threatening. Every unexpected sound in my flat made me check the windows and doors. But nothing obvious happened. No more photographs, no threatening phone calls, no signs that anyone was following me or monitoring my activities beyond what had already been demonstrated. I never tried to reconnect with the chat room or access any more hidden streaming content. The whole experience had taught me that some forms of belonging come with prices you don't discover until it's too late to back out safely. But I still think about that health and safety poster and how such a mundane detail had revealed that extreme content wasn't being produced in distant foreign countries, but potentially in buildings I might walk past every day. And I think about the missing student whose case I'd researched, wondering whether they'd also been looking for somewhere to belong when they encountered people who were considerably more dangerous than they appeared. Sometimes I wonder if the chat room is still active with new participants, and whether other isolated students are being drawn into discussions that seem academic and intellectual until they realize they've become part of something they can't safely leave. It felt like a game at first, but I quickly learned it wasn't, and what followed would change my life. My parents worked long hours, and I was an only child, which meant most evenings were spent alone in my room in our terrace house in Reading, supposedly doing GCSE coursework, but actually scrolling through whatever caught my attention online. The internet was more entertaining than television, and considerably more entertaining than the homework I was meant to be doing. I'd started with the usual social media platforms, but they got repetitive quickly. Same people posting the same types of content, same arguments about the same topics, same manufactured drama that felt hollow after a while. I wanted something more authentic, more immediate, more real than the polished nonsense everyone was sharing. That's when I discovered image boards, not the mainstream ones that everyone knew about, but smaller, more obscure communities where people shared content that wouldn't survive long on regular platforms. Raw, unfiltered material that felt genuine in ways that social media never did. The sort of places where people posted without worrying about maintaining personal brands or managing public images. The content was hit and miss, sometimes interesting, sometimes disturbing, often just random nonsense that someone had found amusing enough to share. But there was an authenticity to it that I found appealing. People weren't performing for audiences the way they did elsewhere online. They were just sharing whatever they'd encountered or created. One image board I frequented had a section dedicated to what they called rare finds, unusual content that people had discovered in the deeper parts of the internet. Not necessarily illegal material, just things that were difficult to find or access through normal browsing. The discussions were more sophisticated than you'd expect from random internet users. People analyzed the authenticity of footage, discussed technical aspects of content creation, shared methods for accessing hidden or restricted material. It felt like being part of an exclusive research community. That's where I first encountered mentions of red rooms. The concept was straightforward enough. Live streams supposedly hidden on the dark web, where viewers could watch real violence happening in real time. Most participants dismissed them as technically unfeasible urban legends, but a few claimed to have encountered evidence suggesting they might actually exist. What made me pay attention was how casually these discussions happened. People weren't treating it like creepypasta or horror fiction. They discussed red rooms the same way they discussed any other type of online content, as something that probably existed somewhere, even if it was difficult to access. One regular poster, who went by Streamfinder, claimed to have archived material from what appeared to be genuine Red Room broadcasts. He was selective about who he shared content with, requiring people to contribute interesting finds before he'd provide access to his collection. I spent several weeks proving my interest by sharing unusual content I discovered on other platforms. Nothing extreme, just rare or hard to find material that demonstrated I was serious about documenting authentic internet phenomena rather than just seeking sensational content. Streamfinder eventually shared some files from his archive, video clips that showed dark rooms with industrial equipment, bound figures, interface elements suggesting live streaming capabilities. The quality was poor enough that it could have been elaborate fiction, but detailed enough to be potentially genuine. What struck me as possibly authentic was the mundane elements that would be easy to overlook if you were creating hoaxes. Background sounds that suggested specific geographic locations, equipment brands visible in some shots, timestamps that corresponded to real dates and times. Streamfinder explained that accessing live Red Room streams required more than just knowing where to look. The hidden services changed locations frequently and weren't easy to find through casual browsing. But if I was genuinely interested in documenting whether red rooms were real phenomena or elaborate fiction, he could potentially arrange for me to observe a live stream that was scheduled for later that week. I should have declined at that point. My interest in unusual internet content was supposed to be about finding authentic material, not witnessing actual crimes. But the way Streamfinder described it made it sound like an academic exercise rather than participation in something illegal. The access process was more complex than anything I'd encountered before. Specific software to download, rotating passwords that changed every few hours, designated connection times that had to be followed precisely. The whole system felt designed to exclude casual browsers while providing access to serious researchers. When I finally connected to the stream during a quiet evening at home, the interface was surprisingly basic. A video player embedded in a simple web page, chat window below, viewer counter showing about 150 people online. Nothing sophisticated about the presentation. The video showed what appeared to be a converted basement or garage space. Concrete walls, harsh fluorescent lighting, minimal furniture except for a metal table positioned in the center of the frame. The atmosphere felt industrial rather than domestic. Strapped to the table was a woman who appeared to be in her 20s, conscious but not moving much. She would occasionally test her restraints or look around the room, but mostly just lay there with the resigned expression of someone who'd stopped fighting against their situation. The chat was active with comments in multiple languages. People discussing what they wanted to see happen, making suggestions, treating the whole thing like interactive entertainment. The casual way they discussed real violence was more disturbing than the violence itself. I watched for about an hour while my parents were downstairs watching television, using headphones so they wouldn't hear anything from my room. The woman would periodically struggle against the restraints or attempt to speak, but no audio was coming through the stream. Around 9 p.m., someone entered the frame. They were dressed in ordinary work clothes, jeans, plain shirt, boots that looked like they'd seen regular use. Nothing theatrical about their appearance, no mask or costume. Just someone who could have been starting any manual job, except for what they were obviously planning to do. The figure moved around the space with practiced efficiency, arranging tools on a nearby surface, adjusting camera angles, checking equipment that wasn't visible in the main video feed. They worked methodically, following what appeared to be a familiar routine. The chat became more excited as preparations continued. People were making specific requests, sharing experiences from previous streams, discussing what they hoped to see happen. The viewer count had climbed to over 200. About 20 minutes into the preparations, I noticed something that made me look more carefully at the background details in the video feed. On the wall behind the table was a local business calendar, one of those promotional items that companies give out to customers at the beginning of each year. The business name was partially visible, and it looked familiar in a way that made me uncomfortable. I paused the stream and looked more closely at the calendar. The company name was for a plumbing supplier in Reading, the same town where I lived. I'd seen their van parked outside houses in my neighborhood when they were doing repair work or installations, which meant this stream was potentially being broadcast from somewhere local rather than some distant foreign location. The realization made everything feel more immediate and real. This wasn't abstract criminal activity happening somewhere else. It was potentially occurring within a few miles of where I was sitting in my bedroom. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessively researching the plumbing company and their customer base. They serviced residential and commercial properties throughout Reading and the surrounding areas, including industrial units and warehouse spaces that would be perfect for activities people wanted to keep private. I started paying attention to their vans when I saw them around town, noting which properties they visited and whether any locations seemed unusual or suspicious. Most were obviously legitimate, houses and businesses that needed normal plumbing work, but I noticed they'd done work at several commercial properties that appeared to be vacant or underutilized based on their external appearance. Empty office buildings, unused warehouse units, the sort of places where someone could operate without being noticed by neighbors. One location particularly caught my attention because it was in an industrial area about 20 minutes from my house, and the plumbing company had visited several times over the past few months, according to the work schedules visible on their website. I decided to take a look at the area during a weekend, using revision time as an excuse to get out of the house. The industrial estate was mostly legitimate businesses, but several units were clearly vacant with to let signs and boarded windows. The unit that had received multiple plumbing visits was officially empty according to the estate agent's signage, but showed signs of recent activity. Fresh tire tracks in the car park, windows that had been covered from inside rather than just boarded up, utility connections that suggested power and water were still active. From the road, everything looked normal, just another vacant commercial property waiting for new tenants. But knowing what I potentially knew about local Red Room operations made it feel sinister in ways that were difficult to explain. I walked past several times over the next week, varying my route and timing to avoid appearing suspicious. Most of the time, there was no obvious activity, but occasionally I'd notice vehicles parked outside that weren't there regularly. One evening, I saw light coming from inside the unit despite it being officially vacant. Not normal commercial lighting, but the harsh, bright illumination that would be needed for filming or broadcasting. That's when I realized I might be looking at the actual location where the stream I'd watched was being produced. Streamfinder had mentioned that what I'd observed wasn't an isolated incident. He offered to provide access to additional streams if I was serious about documenting their activities. I should have declined and focused on my GCS-ES instead, but the discovery that this might be happening locally had made it feel more urgent and important than just another piece of unusual internet content. The next stream he arranged access to was scheduled for the following weekend. Different location, different setup, but the same basic format. Live violence broadcast to paying audiences who treated real suffering as entertainment. This time, the identifying details were clearer. Not just a local business calendar, but a window that showed part of what appeared to be a residential street. Houses with a particular architectural style, streetlights with distinctive designs, road markings that were obviously British. The architectural style looked familiar because it was similar to houses in my own neighborhood. Those Victorian terraces, the specific streetlight designs used by the local council, even the particular type of paving stones visible in the road. It all looked very much like areas of Reading I knew well. I spent hours comparing the glimpse of street visible through that window with online maps and street view images of my local area. The match wasn't exact, but it was close enough to suggest the stream was being broadcast from somewhere within the town where I lived. The realization that red rooms might be operating in my own community, rather than some distant location, made everything feel more dangerous and immediate. These weren't abstract criminals in foreign countries. They were people who might shop in the same places, use the same roads, possibly even live on streets I walked down regularly. I started researching local missing person reports, looking for cases that might correspond to victims I'd seen in streams. Without knowing exactly when people had been taken or having clear physical descriptions, it was impossible to make definitive connections. But I did find several reports of people who disappeared without obvious explanation over the past year. Not enough to establish any clear pattern, but more than you'd normally expect in a town the size of Reading. One case particularly bothered me because the missing person was someone around my own age. A 17-year-old who'd been reported missing about 3 months earlier after failing to return home from college. The physical description and age were similar to someone I thought I'd seen in one of the archive streams Streamfinder had shared. The circumstances of the disappearance were unusual because there had been no obvious reason for the person to leave voluntarily, and no evidence of where they might have gone. They'd simply vanished between college and home on what should have been a routine journey. I researched the route they would have taken and found it passed through several areas with vacant commercial properties, including the industrial estate, where I'd noticed the suspicious activity. It would have been easy for someone to intercept them in a relatively isolated area without witnesses. The possibility that someone my own age from my own town might have become a victim in the streams I'd been watching made everything feel personal in ways I hadn't expected. This wasn't just about documenting unusual internet phenomena. It was about real people from my community suffering for the entertainment of online audiences. I considered reporting what I'd discovered to the police, but I knew how that would sound. 16-year-old claims to have found evidence of live murder streams based on recognizing local business calendars and street architecture. Without more concrete evidence, they dismiss it as internet fantasy. More importantly, I was worried about what might happen if the people behind the red rooms discovered that someone had identified their activities. They demonstrated willingness to commit serious violence for entertainment. What would they do to protect themselves from exposure? Instead, I decided to gather more evidence before making any reports. Document activity at suspicious locations, record when lights were visible in supposedly vacant properties, note which vehicles visited and when. But as I was conducting this informal surveillance, I started noticing that I might not be the only person watching these locations. Other people seemed to be taking unusual interest in the same properties I was monitoring. Not obviously suspicious behavior, just individuals who appeared more often than random chance would suggest, positioned where they could observe the vacant units without being obvious about it. One person I noticed regularly was someone who looked like they might be around college age, watching the industrial estate from different positions over several days. Not someone I recognized from my own college, but possibly a student from elsewhere in Reading. The possibility that other people had discovered the same connections I had made me realize that my investigation might not be as secret as I'd assumed. If multiple people were monitoring these locations, then whoever was behind this might already be aware that their activities had been identified. That evening, I found a note that had been slipped under my bedroom door while I was downstairs having dinner with my parents. Just a single piece of paper with a printed message that made my hands shake as I read it. Games should stay games. No signature, no return address, nothing that would identify who had sent it. But the timing and content made it clear that someone knew about my interest in red rooms and wanted me to stop investigating. The word games particularly bothered me because it echoed my own initial reaction to finding the streams. Someone had been watching me closely enough to know how I'd approach this situation, what my motivations were, possibly even what I'd been thinking. I threw the note away and tried to convince myself it was coincidence or someone playing a prank, but I couldn't explain how they'd obtained my home address and managed to deliver the message without my parents noticing anything unusual. Over the next few days, I became increasingly paranoid about being watched. Every stranger I saw near my house felt threatening. Every unexpected sound made me check the windows and doors. But nothing obvious happened. No more notes, no threatening phone calls, no signs that anyone was following me or monitoring my activities. Just the persistent feeling that someone was paying closer attention to my routine than felt comfortable. I stopped visiting the industrial estate and tried to focus on my GCSE revision instead. But I couldn't shake the knowledge of what I'd discovered, or the fear that I'd gotten too close to something dangerous. The lights stopped appearing in the vacant units around the same time I stopped conducting surveillance. Either the activities had moved elsewhere, or whoever was responsible had decided to suspend things until the attention died down. I never reported what I'd discovered to the authorities. The evidence was too circumstantial, and the risks too obvious. Instead, I tried to pretend the whole thing had never happened and focus on preparing for my exams. But I still think about that first stream and how it had felt like a game until I realized the victims were real people from my own community. How the distance created by computer screens and internet anonymity had made it easy to treat serious violence as entertainment. And I think about how many other similar operations might be running in vacant commercial properties across the country, operated by people who look and act like ordinary members of their communities when they're not broadcasting real suffering to paying audiences. Sometimes I wonder if other people my age have stumbled across similar activities in their own towns, thinking they were just exploring unusual internet content until they realized the victims were real people from their own communities, whether they reported what they found or stayed quiet like I did, too scared to risk becoming the next person to disappear between college and home on what should have been a routine journey. I want to share something that happened to me about 6 months ago. I've been debating whether to tell anyone, but after seeing a similar underground cinema club being advertised in another city, I feel obligated to warn people about what might be happening behind those unmarked doors. This experience fundamentally changed how I view artistic boundaries and made me question the nature of entertainment in ways I never imagined possible. For context, I work as a film studies lecturer at a small university in Leeds. My specialization is in extreme cinema. Films that push boundaries of taste, morality, and acceptability. I've spent years analyzing how filmmakers create authentic-looking violence, from Hitchcock's chocolate syrup blood in Psycho, to modern digital effects that can make almost anything appear real. This academic interest occasionally leads me down unusual paths, including studies of banned films and censorship history. Last January, one of my postgrad students mentioned an exclusive film club operating in an abandoned warehouse district. According to him, they screened controversial works that couldn't be shown in mainstream venues, experimental films, banned international releases, and underground productions that circulated primarily on the dark web. As someone who regularly monitored certain dark web forums for my research on film censorship, I was immediately intrigued. These spaces often discuss fringe productions that existed in legal grey areas, and I'd written several academic papers on how the dark web had become a distribution channel for extreme cinema that couldn't find conventional outlets. My student provided me with a link to a tour site that served as the club's digital front door. The site itself was minimalist but professional. Black background, white text, no images except a stylist eye logo. It described an immersive viewing experience for discerning audiences and promised performances that transcend the boundaries between cinema and reality. To receive an invitation, you had to complete a questionnaire that tested your knowledge of extreme cinema history and submit the cryptocurrency equivalent of £200 as a membership contribution. Academic curiosity got the better of me, and I justified the expense as research for an upcoming paper on underground distribution networks. 3 days after submitting my application, I received an encrypted email containing an address, date, and time, along with instructions to arrive alone and bring no recording devices. The location was in an industrial area outside the city centre, the kind of place that had once housed textile factories, but now contained a mixture of art studios, rehearsal spaces, and abandoned buildings awaiting redevelopment. I arrived on a particularly cold Friday evening, following directions to what appeared to be a disused printing facility. The entrance was unmarked save for a small red light above a metal door, where a man in black checked names against a tablet. After confirming my identity and running a handheld scanner over me to check for recording devices, he ushered me into a dimly lit corridor that sloped downward into the building's basement levels. The screening room itself was surprisingly sophisticated. About 50 black leather seats arranged in a semicircle faced a proper cinema screen. The walls were covered in sound-absorbing material, and professional-looking lighting rigs hung from the ceiling. Perhaps 30 people were already seated, most middle-aged or older, predominantly male, all dressed well. Not the crowd of edgy students or counterculture types I had expected. They had the quiet confidence of the genuinely wealthy, the kind of people who collect rare art rather than those who merely consume it. A woman in a tailored black suit distributed what appeared to be program notes, expensive paper, minimalist design, containing only titles and running times, no directors or cast information. The evening would consist of 4 short films collectively titled Veracity, each approximately 20 minutes long. The notes explained these were part of an ongoing series exploring the ultimate authenticity in performance. The lights dimmed, and the first film began without introduction. The production quality was immediately striking. This wasn't the shaky camera amateur work I'd expected from an underground screening. The cinematography was precise, the lighting meticulous, the sound design immersive. The content depicted what appeared to be an interrogation scenario. a person bound to a chair in a concrete room, being systematically tormented by an unseen questioner. What stood out was the performers' reactions. Their fear seemed unnervingly genuine, their pain responses physiologically accurate in ways that even the best actors typically can't replicate. I remember thinking how impressive the performance was, how the actor captured the subtle progression from defiance to terror to resignation. I noted technical details, how the camera never cut away during the most extreme moments, how the sound captured every labored breath and whimper with perfect clarity. As an academic who had studied cinematic violence for years, I appreciated the technical achievement while remaining emotionally detached. The second film featured a different setting, a sterile white room with medical equipment, but similar themes of confinement and suffering. By the third film, however, something began to feel deeply wrong. The consistency of the performances across different scenarios, the absolute commitment of the subjects to their roles, the complete absence of any cinematic relief or distancing techniques. It all began to suggest something beyond mere acting. I glanced around at the audience, expecting to see others sharing my growing discomfort. Instead, I observed people watching with intense concentration, some taking notes, others occasionally nodding in apparent appreciation. A few were using tablets, seemingly adjusting settings or parameters while watching. One man near me was recording detailed timestamps alongside written observations. The fourth and final film removed any doubt about what I was witnessing. It began like the others, but progressed to a conclusion that could not possibly be simulated. No special effect, no matter how convincing, could replicate what I saw. No professional actor would or could endure such an experience. No ethical filmmaker would create such content. This wasn't extreme cinema pushing boundaries. It was actual violence being presented as art. I felt physically ill, my academic detachment shattered by the inescapable realization that I had been watching real people suffering and dying, not performances. The audience's appreciative murmurs around me took on a horrifying new context. These weren't film enthusiasts admiring technical achievements. They were connoisseurs of actual human suffering. As the lights came up, I struggled to maintain composure, to appear as though I was simply processing challenging artistic content rather than reeling from evidence of actual crimes. A man in a dark suit approached the front of the room and thanked everyone for attending, mentioning that feedback interfaces were available in the adjoining room for those who wished to contribute to future productions. I followed the crowd, desperate to maintain my cover while looking for an exit. The adjoining space resembled a gallery with tablets mounted on pedestals. Attendees were providing detailed feedback on the performances they had just witnessed, and more disturbingly, suggestions for future productions. Some appeared to be bidding on specific scenarios they wanted to see realized. On one screen, I glimpsed what appeared to be a selection interface for performer characteristics, age ranges, physical attributes, even personality types described as resistant, compliant, or volatile. My horror deepened when I noticed a section of the room separated by a glass partition. Behind it, technical staff worked at computers displaying what appeared to be dark web interfaces. One screen showed a chat where users were discussing what they had just watched, alongside cryptocurrency transaction records. Another displayed a global map with viewership statistics. This wasn't just a local screening. It was being streamed to paying viewers internationally, with this select audience serving as a live focus group for future content. I needed to leave immediately, but the exit was monitored by security. I forced myself to approach one of the feedback stations, pretending to input responses while desperately trying to appear unaffected. The tablet asked detailed questions about which elements of the performances I found most compelling, which physical reactions seemed most authentic, and how future productions could be enhanced. After approximately 10 minutes of this charade, I casually made my way toward what appeared to be a bathroom, then slipped down a service corridor and eventually found an emergency exit. The alarm that sounded when I pushed through the door was almost a relief, providing cover for my escape into the cold night air. I spent the next week in a state of moral crisis. I knew I should report what I had witnessed to the police, but several factors gave me pause. I had no evidence beyond my testimony. I had willingly paid to attend. I had accessed the dark web to find the screening. Most significantly, I feared that the organization behind this operation had recorded everyone who attended, including me, creating a mutual assured destruction scenario where reporting them would implicate myself as a knowing viewer. When I finally worked up the courage to make an anonymous report, I discovered the building had been completely vacated, professionally cleaned, and put up for lease 3 days after the screening. The tour site had disappeared, the email address was defunct, and I had no names, just faces I might not even recognize in daylight. 2 months later, I received an unmarked envelope containing a USB drive. Against my better judgment, I checked it on a secure computer. It contained only 2 items: a high-resolution still image of me sitting in the audience, looking distressed during the final film, and a text file with a list of my personal details: home address, university office number, parents' names and addresses, and my regular jogging route through the park. Below this information was a simple message: your feedback was noted. Your discretion is appreciated. A new screening series begins soon. I've since moved cities and changed jobs. I no longer research extreme cinema and have abandoned my academic interest in the dark web. But I remain haunted by the knowledge that somewhere these productions continue, with audiences of seemingly respectable people gathering to watch actual atrocities under the guise of exclusive art. Most disturbing of all is how quickly I recognized the technical quality of what I was seeing before recognizing its reality, how my academic training to analyze fictional violence initially blinded me to actual violence presented in the same context. It makes me wonder how thin the line really is between simulated and real horror, and how easily that line can be crossed when something is framed as art or entertainment. Last week, I saw a poster for an exclusive underground cinema experience in Birmingham with the same stylized eye logo. I tore it down, but I know it's futile. These screenings will continue as long as there are people willing to pay to watch. People who tell themselves they're appreciating extreme art rather than participating in actual atrocity. And somewhere in that audience might be another academic, another film enthusiast, another person who doesn't realize what they're really watching until it's too late. I don't think I ever really believed the footage was real until I recognized the wallpaper in the background. At 17, I spent most of my time online looking for things I wasn't supposed to see. Not porn or anything like that. My mates could handle that side of things well enough. I was after the stuff that got removed from platforms, the videos people whispered about in college corridors, the content that lived in the spaces between what was legal and what wasn't. It started with a mate showing me some grainy footage on his phone during lunch break. Something about a car crash in Russia, supposedly real CCTV footage that had been leaked online. Turned out to be fake, obviously, but it opened up a whole world I hadn't known existed. Forums where people shared banned documentaries, sites hosting films that had been pulled from cinemas, archives of news footage that broadcasters didn't want circulating. My bedroom became my research station. Mum and Dad thought I was just being antisocial, which was partly true. They'd call me down for dinner, and I'd mumble something about having coursework. Most of the time, they left me alone. Dad was usually in front of the television anyway, and Mum had her own programs to catch up on. The progression was natural enough. What shocked me one week became boring the next. I needed something more authentic, more immediate. The obviously fake stuff stopped working once you learned to spot the tells. Bad audio mixing, theatrical blood, actors who couldn't quite sell the fear convincingly. That's when I first came across mentions of Red Rooms. The concept was straightforward. Live streams where viewers could watch real violence happening in real time. Some versions claimed you could influence what happened through donations or chat commands. Most people dismissed it as internet mythology, the sort of thing that sounded plausible enough to generate discussion, but was too complicated and risky to actually exist. I spent months following leads across different platforms, encrypted messaging apps, obscure forums, recommendation chains that led nowhere most of the time. The deep web wasn't as mysterious as people made it out to be, mostly just marketplaces and file sharing. But finding specific content required patience and the right connections. The breakthrough came through someone calling themselves Deep Watcher on a forum dedicated to documenting real violence. He claimed to have access to exclusive content that would make everything I'd seen before look tame. I was skeptical initially. Half the people online claimed to have secret access to the internet's hidden corners. But his approach was different, more cautious. He'd share screenshots rather than links, timestamps from conversations rather than direct invitations. The images were disturbing. Basement rooms with concrete walls, metal furniture, figures in shadow, but they could have been from anywhere. What convinced me was a detail in one of his screenshots, a streaming interface with a viewer counter showing 847 people watching. It was such an ordinary detail, the sort of thing you wouldn't think to include if you were creating a hoax. After proving my interest over several weeks, Deep Watcher sent me instructions for accessing what he called a private stream. Not a simple link, but a series of steps involving specific software and rotating passwords. The whole process felt designed to filter out casual browsers. The interface was basic when I finally connected. A video player on a black web page, chat window below, viewer counter on the side showing about 600 people online. The video showed what looked like an industrial space. Concrete floor, harsh lighting, metal chair in the center. There was someone strapped to the chair. Male, maybe 30s, conscious but not moving much. The chat was active with comments in various languages, mostly discussing what they wanted to see happen next. I watched for nearly an hour before anything significant occurred. The man occasionally tested his restraints or looked around the room with the confused expression of someone trying to work out where they were. The chat kept a running commentary, placing bets, making suggestions, treating the whole thing like entertainment. Then someone entered the frame. Ordinary clothes, jeans, dark hoodie, regular trainers. Nothing theatrical about the appearance. No mask, though the camera angle meant I never saw their face clearly. They moved around methodically, adjusting equipment, checking camera positions like they were following a routine. The chat became more excited. Numbers appeared. Not pounds or dollars, something else entirely. People were making requests in multiple languages. The viewer count climbed past 800. What happened next was systematic and deliberate. The figure selected tools from a nearby table, held them up for the camera, then approached the chair. The victim became more alert, struggling against the restraints with increasing desperation as he understood his situation. The violence was different from anything in the films I'd collected. Those had been fiction, however convincing. This was immediate and unfiltered. The sounds were raw, the responses genuine. When the man screamed, it wasn't performance. The figure worked slowly, aware of their audience, responsive to the chat comments. The viewer count passed 900. People were clearly enjoying themselves. About 20 minutes in, the camera angle shifted, and I got a partial view of the figure's profile. Nothing distinctive, but something about the jawline and ear shape seemed familiar. Someone I'd seen before, though I couldn't place where. The realization came gradually. College maybe, or around town. Someone I'd passed on the street or seen at the bus stop. A face I recognized without knowing the name attached to it. My hands started shaking as I tried to remember where I'd encountered him. The knowledge was there, but just out of reach. Someone local, someone from Leeds. The chat had noticed the clearer camera angle too. Comments appeared about recognizing the person from previous streams. Someone posted a screenshot highlighting the profile view. That's when I saw the reflection. In the victim's eyes, staring directly at the camera, was the faint outline of a computer screen, the glow from a laptop display in a dark room. And in that reflection, barely visible, but definitely there, was a face. Mine. I closed the laptop immediately and sat in my dark bedroom, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, that it had been a trick of the light or my mind creating patterns where none existed after hours of watching something disturbing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes had been looking specifically at me, not at the camera generally, but at me personally, as if the victim somehow knew exactly who was watching and where I was sitting. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound from outside made me check the window. Every creak from the house made me verify my door was locked. I kept thinking about that familiar face, becoming more certain I knew exactly who it was. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what had happened. It could have been an elaborate fake, the sort of sophisticated production someone with serious technical skills might create. The reflection could have been added digitally. The familiar face could have been coincidental. But when I checked my messages, I found something that made my stomach drop. A private message from Deepwatcher, sent 3 hours earlier. Thanks for watching last night. Always nice to have local support. See you around. I deleted everything immediately. Account, browsing history, downloaded software, written notes. I told myself the message could have meant anything, that he probably sent similar notes to lots of viewers. But that word, local, stuck with me. I started paying attention when I left the house, looking for that face in crowds, checking behind me more often. Every person in a hoodie made me nervous. Anyone who seemed to look in my direction for too long made me change route. 3 weeks later, I saw him outside college, standing by the gates, looking at his phone like any other student. Same jawline, same build as the figure from the stream. He glanced up as I approached, and our eyes met briefly. He smiled. Nothing threatening, just the sort of polite acknowledgement you might give someone you'd seen, around, but didn't know well. Casual and normal. But I recognized something in that smile. He knew who I was, just as I now knew who he was. I changed my route to college after that, started taking different buses, varying my schedule, avoiding places where I'd seen him. My parents noticed I was more withdrawn, but assumed it was college stress. Because I was being followed, though subtly. He was always just far enough away to seem coincidental, in places where he had legitimate reasons to be. Outside shops I used, on buses I called regularly, in the background of places I visited, never approaching or threatening, just present often enough to let me know he was paying attention. I couldn't tell anyone about it. How do you explain being stalked by someone you encountered through watching illegal content online? How do you report to police that someone you saw committing crimes on the internet is now following you around town? You don't. You learn to live with it, sleep with furniture against your door, carry something sharp in your pocket, check behind curtains before sitting down, and you try not to think about what they might be planning. Whether you're going to be the next person in that chair, staring into a camera while strangers watch online. Whether your own reflection is already visible somewhere, waiting for the right moment. I still don't sleep well. Every night I listen for sounds that don't belong, watch for movement that shouldn't be there. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still being monitored through devices I haven't thought to check. But mostly I think about those eyes, how they seem to look through the screen directly at me, how they reflected not just my face, but something deeper that suggested the distance between watching and being watched isn't as secure as I'd assumed. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I wonder if I'm still connected to that stream somehow, if people are still watching somewhere, still waiting. I haven't told anyone about this, not the police, not my sister, certainly not the people I see every day in the village. There's a specific kind of weight that comes with knowing something you can't unknow. A heaviness that sits right at the base of your throat, making every swallow feel like a conscious effort. I suppose I'm writing this down because I need to get it out of my head before it rots there. If you're listening to this or reading it, I just want you to understand that I wasn't looking for trouble. I'm not a curious person by nature. I'm a furniture restorer. I spend my days with sandpaper, beeswax, and the quiet company of dead men's wardrobes. It's a solitary life, and usually that's exactly how I like it. I live in a small stone-built cottage just outside of a place called Minchinhampton in the Cotswolds. It's the kind of village where the most exciting thing that happens is a dispute over a garden fence or a particularly heavy frost on the common. My workshop is a converted barn at the back of the property. It's filled with the smell of turpentine and old oak. About 4 months ago, I picked up a piece at a probate auction in Cirencester. It was a mid-19th century Davenport, a small ornamental desk with a sloped top. It was in a sorry state, caked in layers of cheap varnish that some previous owner had slapped on in the 70s, but the bones of it were good. The Davenport had belonged to a man named Mr. Henderson. He'd been a retired schoolmaster, well liked in his village, a man of routine and quiet dignity. He'd lived alone for 20 years after his wife passed away in the late 90s. I remember seeing him once or twice at the local library, a thin man with a sharp nose and eyes that always seemed to be looking for a mistake in a piece of prose. When he died, he left no heirs, so his entire estate went to auction. I paid about £80 for the desk, thinking it would be a nice project for the autumn. It sat in the corner of my workshop for a few weeks before I got around to it. The weather had turned cold, that damp English cold that gets into your joints, and I spent my mornings by the wood burner, drinking tea and looking at the work ahead. When I finally started stripping the wood, I felt that familiar satisfaction of seeing the real grain emerge from beneath the gunk. It was beautiful walnut. But as I was cleaning out the small side drawers, I noticed a discrepancy in the depth of the bottom one. You'd be surprised how many old desks have secret compartments. Usually they're empty, or they contain a few halfpennies, a dried out inkwell, or perhaps a yellowing letter from a long dead lover. This one, however, had a small, modern-looking USB drive tucked into a velvet-lined slot behind the false back of a drawer. It looked completely out of place against the Victorian joinery. a jagged piece of the 21st century buried in the 19th. I should have thrown it in the bin. That's the thought that loops in my mind every night when the house gets quiet and the shadows start to stretch. I should have just tossed it into the scrap pile and gone back to my beeswax. But it was a rainy Tuesday, the tea was cold, and the solitude of the barn felt a bit too heavy. I took the drive into the house and plugged it into my laptop, sitting at my kitchen table with the rain drumming against the glass. There wasn't much on it, just a single text file. No name, no date. When I opened it, there was a string of letters and numbers that looked like gibberish, followed by a series of instructions. It didn't look like a normal web address. It was long, messy, and ended in a suffix I didn't recognize. Below that was a password, the Gleaner. I'm not a tech person. I use my computer for invoices, ordering brass handles, and looking up upholstery fabrics. But I'd heard enough over the years to know what this was. I'd heard the stories about the parts of the internet that don't show up on a search engine, the hidden layers that require specific pathways to access, what people call the dark web. I didn't think it was dangerous. I thought it was a curiosity, a relic of whoever had owned that desk, perhaps a secret life of Mr. Henderson that no one in the village would have suspected. I followed the instructions, which involved a few settings changes I had to look up on my phone, and eventually I found myself staring at a screen that was almost entirely black. There were no images, no banners, just plain white typewriter-style font on a charcoal background. At the top, it simply stated, "The Registry of Open Doors." I remember feeling a bit let down. It sounded like something to do with architecture, or perhaps a charity for the homeless. I clicked the only link on the page, which was a list of UK counties. I scrolled down to Gloucestershire. The page that loaded was a table. It had 4 columns: town, village, street, entry point, and status. I started scrolling, my heart beginning to do that slow, heavy thud against my ribs. These weren't shops or businesses. They were houses, private homes: Stroud, Bisley Road, kitchen window, faulty latch, occupied, Cheltenham, Lansdowne Crescent, basement door, key under stone, unoccupied, Holiday, Nailsworth, Shortwood, back door, always left open for cat. I felt a coldness wash over me that had nothing to do with the draft in my cottage. I kept scrolling, my eyes blurring as I looked for names I knew. I found a house in Minchinhampton, just 3 miles from where I was sitting. It described a bungalow on the edge of the common, where an elderly woman lived. It noted that she often forgot to bolt the side door after taking the bins out on a Wednesday evening. It even mentioned the time, usually around 9 at night. This wasn't a site for hackers or some grand criminal enterprise. It was a ledger for people who liked to go where they weren't invited. It was a community of shadows. There were no memberships or chat rooms, just this cold, clinical list of vulnerabilities. It was a map of how to slip into the lives of strangers. I sat there for a long time, the blue light of the screen reflecting in the window glass. I felt like I was looking at a map of a world I didn't belong in, a world that existed parallel to the one where people bought milk and complained about the weather. I told myself it was probably fake, some kind of elaborate prank, or an old file that hadn't been updated in years. To prove it to myself, I decided to check one of the entries. The bungalow in Minchinhampton was only a short drive away. I told myself I was going there to make sure the woman was safe. I told myself I'd just check the door, and if it was open, I'd knock and tell her to be more careful. It was about 10 o'clock at night. The air was damp and smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. I parked my car a few streets away and walked. The bungalow was quiet, the lights dimmed. I felt like a criminal just walking up the driveway, my boots crunching on the gravel. I crept around to the side of the house, my breath hitching in my chest. There it was, a white UPVC door. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pressed the handle. It clicked. The door swung open an inch, revealing the dark, warm interior of a utility room. The smell of fabric softener and old dog drifted out into the night air. I didn't knock. I didn't warn her. I was so terrified by the reality of it that I pulled the door shut, making sure the latch engaged, and I ran. I ran all the way back to my car, my lungs burning, the taste of copper in my mouth. When I got home, I went straight back to the laptop. I wanted to close the page, to delete the file, to pretend I'd never seen it. But as I moved the mouse, I noticed a new link had appeared at the bottom of the Gloucestershire page. It was titled Recent Observations. I clicked it. It was a log of visits. It wasn't just a list of doors. It was a diary of intrusions. People described the things they did once they were inside. They didn't steal anything. That was the most unsettling part. There were no reports of missing jewelry or televisions. Instead, they wrote about sitting in people's armchairs while they slept upstairs. They wrote about moving a single photograph from one shelf to another. They wrote about breathing the same air as a sleeping family and then leaving without a trace. One entry, dated only 2 nights prior, described a house in Cirencester. The visitor had spent roughly 3 hours in the kitchen. They had made themselves a cup of tea, washed the mug, and put it back in the wrong cupboard. They described the sound of the husband snoring in the room directly above them. They mentioned the brand of toothpaste in the bathroom. They even noted that the couple's cat had sat on their lap for a portion of the visit. I felt physically sick. The mundane nature of it was far worse than any story of a break-in I'd ever heard. This was a violation of the very idea of home. It was the knowledge that your most private spaces were being treated like a public gallery by strangers who wanted nothing more than to prove they could be there. They weren't after your money, they were after your sense of security. I spent the next few days in a state of hypervigilance. I checked my own locks 4-5 times an evening. I installed a motion sensor light over the workshop door. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind in the ivy sounded like a footstep. I kept thinking about that USB drive. Why was it in that desk? Who had been using it? The more I thought about Mr. Henderson, the more I wondered. Had he been a visitor, or had he been a victim who had somehow discovered the drive? The clinical, precise nature of the text on the drive seemed to match his personality, but I couldn't reconcile the image of the kindly schoolmaster with the person who would stand in a stranger's utility room at 3 a.m. On the 4th night, I couldn't help myself. I went back on the site. I had to know if there was more. I needed to see if my own house was on there. I searched for my village. There was only one entry. Minchinhampton, the old barn cottage. My heart stopped. That was me. That was my home. I clicked the entry. It didn't just list the door. It was much more detailed than the others. It described the workshop side window and how the wooden frame was rotted at the base. It explained that a firm push would bypass the lock entirely. It also mentioned that the internal door leading from the workshop to the kitchen was usually left on the latch. I looked toward the kitchen door. I'd lived here for 6 years, and I'd never once thought about that rot in the workshop window. I always kept the internal door closed, but on the latch was exactly how I left it, so the heat from the Aga would reach the back of the house. It was a detail I'd never shared with anyone. I scrolled down to the observations for my house. There were 3 entries. The first, was from about a month ago. Visited between 2:15 and 3:45. Subject sleeps heavily. The house smells of linseed oil and old paper. Moved the bookmarks in 3 books on the bedside table. Subject did not wake. I remembered that. I'd woken up and found my place lost in the biography of Thomas Chippendale I was reading. I'd assumed I'd just been tired and forgotten where I was. I felt a wave of cold sweat break across my forehead. They had been in my bedroom. They had been standing inches from my face while I slept. The second entry, visited 110. Subject was in the workshop late. Watched through the gap in the barn doors. Subject is restoring the Henderson Davenport. Left a small gift in the hidden compartment for them to find. Curious to see if they follow the trail. The room seemed to tilt. The gift, the USB drive, it hadn't belonged to Mr. Henderson at all. It had been left there for me. It was an invitation. I was being recruited, or perhaps just mocked. They had watched me find it. They had watched me bring it into the house. I couldn't breathe. I was sitting in the very chair where they had watched me sleep. I looked at the dark corners of the living room, the shadows cast by the floor lamp, suddenly seeming deep and hungry. I wasn't alone in my own life. I was a character in someone else's hobby. The third entry was dated today. The timestamp was only about 10 minutes old. Subject is currently viewing the registry. They look distressed. They are sitting in the green armchair. They should have stayed in the workshop. It's much harder to leave a gift when they are awake. The laptop screen flickered. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My voice felt like it had been physically cut out of my throat. I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked on the text. They are looking at the kitchen door now, the screen read. I didn't turn around. I couldn't bring myself to look. I just sat there, in the silence of the Gloucestershire countryside, listening to the slow, rhythmic sound of someone breathing in the darkness of the hallway behind me. The breathing wasn't hurried. It wasn't aggressive. It was calm, matter-of-fact, and terrifyingly close. It was the sound of someone who felt completely at home in my house. I didn't go to the police. What would I say? That someone had been moving my bookmarks? That I'd found a website that shouldn't exist? I just stayed in that chair until the sun came up and the first light of dawn began to grey the windows. When the light finally hit the kitchen floor, the house was empty. The internal door to the workshop was wide open. I've moved now. I couldn't stay there. I sold the cottage at a loss, sold the workshop, and took a small modern flat in a busy part of Bristol. There are 3 locks on my door and a security camera that feeds directly to my phone. I don't restore furniture anymore. I work in a warehouse, surrounded by people and bright fluorescent lights. But the fear hasn't left me. It's just changed shape. The mundane nature of the visits on that site, the tea making, the photograph moving, it makes every small inconsistency in my life feel like a threat. If I can't find my keys, I don't think I've lost them. I think someone has hidden them. If a window is slightly ajar, I don't think it's the wind. I think someone is testing the frame. I haven't gone back to the site. I destroyed the USB drive, smashed it with a hammer until it was nothing but plastic and metal dust, and threw the remains into the River Avon. But I know it's still there. The registry never closes. It just waits for someone else to find a secret, to feel a bit of curiosity on a rainy Tuesday, and to open a door that can never be shut again. I think about the others on that list. The woman in the bungalow, the family in Cirencester. I wonder how many of them are currently being observed. I wonder how many people in this country are living their lives as the unwitting subjects of a silent audience. I stayed up late last night. I couldn't help it. I was sitting on my sofa, looking at the camera feed on my phone. The hallway was empty. The door was locked. But then I noticed something. On the small table by the door, where I keep my post, a single envelope had been moved. It was now sitting at a perfectly right angle to the edge of the table. I know I didn't leave it like that. I looked at the camera footage, scrolling back through the hours. There was nothing. No one had entered. No one had left. But the envelope had moved. That's the real horror of the dark web. It's not just the things you find there. It's the way those things bleed into the real world, turning your own home into a place where you are the stranger. It's the realization that some people don't want to hurt you, or rob you, or even talk to you. They just want to watch you. They want to be the ghost in your machine, the shadow in your hallway, the person who knows exactly how you take your tea, even if you've never met them. I'm sitting here now, in my flat in Bristol, writing this. The sun is setting over the city, and the street lights are starting to flicker on. It's a normal Tuesday evening, but I can hear the lift in the hallway moving. I can hear the muffled sounds of my neighbors, and I can't help but wonder if one of them is currently logging into a black screen, looking for a list of counties, and scrolling down until they find a street they recognize. I think I'll go and check the logs one more time. Not that it matters. If the registry has taught me anything, it's that a lock is just a suggestion to someone who really wants to be inside. And as I walk toward the door, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, in a darkened room, someone is watching me move, waiting for me to settle down for the night, so they can leave me another gift. I haven't slept properly in months. Every time I close my eyes, I see that white text on the charcoal background. I see the list of names, the list of vulnerabilities. I see the clinical descriptions of people's lives. It's a ledger of human fragility. We think our walls protect us, but they only provide the illusion of privacy. We are all just entries in a database we didn't ask to be part of. The furniture restoration business taught me that everything has a hidden side. Every piece of wood has a grain that's buried. Every drawer has a space behind it. I thought I was uncovering beauty. I didn't realize I was uncovering a way for the darkness to get in. If you find something in an old desk, or a hidden drawer, or a box in the attic, leave it. Don't be curious. Don't look for the secret. Because once you know how the door is opened, you can never really believe it's closed again. I'm looking at my phone now. The camera feed is still clear. The hallway is still empty. But the air in the room feels different. It feels occupied. And as I reach for my tea, I notice that the mug is turned slightly to the left. Just enough to be noticed. Just enough to let me know that the visit has already begun. I'm not going to turn around. I'm just going to keep writing until the light goes. Because as long as I'm writing, I'm awake. And as long as I'm awake, they have to wait. But eventually, I'll have to sleep. And that's when the registry really begins its work. The silence of the city is different from the silence of the Cotswolds, but it's no less heavy. In the village, you could blame the wind or the owls. Here, there are only people, thousands of people, all living behind their own doors, all thinking they're safe. I wonder how many of them are on the list tonight. I wonder how many of them will wake up tomorrow and find their bookmark has moved, or their tea has been made, and they'll just shrug it off as a trick of the mind. I wish I could go back to being one of them. I wish I could go back to the days when a creak in the floor was just a creak. But those days are gone. The door is open, and I don't think it's ever going to close. I can hear a faint scratching sound now, coming from the direction of the front door. It's rhythmic, slow, like a fingernail against wood. I'm not going to look. I'm just going to sit here and wait for the morning. It's only a few more hours. I can make it to the morning. I have to. Because if I don't, I'll just be another observation in the log. Another story for someone to read on a black screen in the middle of the night. Another life gleaned by the people who walk in the shadows. I think I hear the handle turning. I'm just going to keep my eyes on the screen. The silence from the speakers made the stream harder to look away from, like watching something through glass that you knew you shouldn't be seeing, but couldn't quite stop yourself from observing. I was 18 and halfway through my A-levels when I got bored with fictional horror and started looking for something real. Not that the creepy pasta forums I'd been frequenting were particularly scary. Most of the stories were obviously made up by teenagers trying to one-up each other with increasingly ridiculous scenarios involving supernatural entities and impossible situations. What I wanted was genuine fear, the sort that comes from knowing something terrible actually happened rather than just imagining it might. Real footage, authentic documentation, evidence of events that would make you lose sleep because they were part of the actual world, rather than someone's creative writing exercise. The transition from fictional horror to real content was gradual. Started with true crime forums, then moved to places where people shared footage from accidents and incidents that mainstream media wouldn't broadcast. Nothing particularly extreme initially, just material that was too graphic or disturbing for regular platforms. Each community led to recommendations for others, and the content kept escalating. Places where people discussed banned documentaries, leaked investigation footage, material that existed in legal grey areas. The sort of communities that felt like digital speakeasies, accessible if you knew where to look, but hidden from casual browsers. One forum I discovered was dedicated to what they called authentic extreme documentation. The participants approached it like academic research, verifying whether violent content was genuine or staged, discussing production techniques, and analyzing geographic indicators with more professionalism than you'd expect from random internet users. That's where I first encountered serious discussions about red rooms. The concept was straightforward. Live streams supposedly hidden on the dark web where viewers could watch real torture and murder happening in real time. Most participants were skeptical, discussing the technical and legal barriers that would make such operations nearly impossible to maintain. But a few claimed to have encountered evidence suggesting red rooms might actually exist. Screenshots of streaming interfaces, recordings of what appeared to be live violence, documentation of hidden services that hosted such content. What made me pay attention was the level of detail in their discussions. These weren't teenagers making up stories about urban legends. They spoke about hosting infrastructure, content distribution, and audience management with expertise that suggested real familiarity rather than speculation. One participant, who went by Archive Seeker, claimed to have documented multiple Red Room operations over the past year. He was cautious about sharing evidence, requiring people to demonstrate serious research interest rather than casual curiosity before providing access to his collection. The verification process involved discussing other extreme content in enough detail to prove you weren't just seeking sensational material. After several weeks of conversation, Archive Seeker finally shared some files from his archive. The material was disturbing but not conclusive. Dark rooms with industrial equipment, bound figures, interface elements suggesting live streaming. It could have been sophisticated fiction or genuine documentation of real events. What struck me as potentially authentic was the mundane details that would be easy to overlook if you were creating hoaxes. background sounds that suggested specific environments, equipment brands visible in shots, timestamps that corresponded to real dates when cross-referenced with news reports. Archive Seeker explained that accessing live Red Room streams required more than just knowing where to look. The hidden services changed locations frequently, operated on irregular schedules, and required personal recommendations from existing viewers, not something you could stumble across accidentally. But if I was genuinely interested in documenting whether Red Rooms were real phenomena or elaborate fiction, he could arrange for me to observe a live stream scheduled for the following week. I should have declined. My interest in extreme content was supposed to be about finding authentic horror stories, not witnessing actual crimes. But curiosity got the better of me, especially since Archive Seeker assured me that observation didn't require participation or payment. The access instructions were complex but manageable. Specific software downloads, rotating passwords, designated connection times. The whole system felt designed to filter out casual browsers while providing access to serious researchers. When I finally connected to the stream, the interface was surprisingly basic. A video player showing a feed from what appeared to be a converted basement, with a chat window below where viewers could communicate. Nothing sophisticated about the presentation. The video showed a concrete-walled space with harsh lighting and minimal furniture. In the center was a metal chair, and strapped to that chair was a man who appeared to be in his 30s. He was conscious, but not moving much, occasionally testing his restraints or looking around the room with obvious confusion. The chat was active with participants discussing what they expected to see happen. Comments in multiple languages suggested an international audience, with people making suggestions and placing bets on various outcomes. The casual way they discussed real violence was more disturbing than the violence itself. I watched for about an hour, using headphones so my parents wouldn't hear anything from my bedroom. The man in the chair would periodically struggle against his restraints or attempt to speak, but no audio was coming through the stream. Just silence that made everything feel more immediate and real. Around 10 p.m., someone entered the frame. They were dressed ordinarily, jeans, plain shirt, work boots. Nothing theatrical about their appearance, no mask or costume. Just someone who could have been anyone, preparing to do something that definitely wasn't ordinary. The figure moved around methodically, arranging tools on a nearby surface, adjusting camera equipment, checking various apparatus that wasn't fully visible in the main feed. They worked with practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first time following this routine. The chat became more excited as preparations continued. People were making specific requests, sharing experiences from previous streams, discussing what they hoped to see happen. The viewer counter showed several hundred people watching. About 20 minutes into the preparations, I noticed something that made me lean closer to my laptop screen. The figure had moved to adjust one of the cameras, and for a moment I got a clearer view of the room's background. On the wall was a fire safety certificate, the sort of official documentation you see in commercial buildings to show they meet safety regulations. The certificate was issued by a company I recognized, a local fire safety firm that did inspections for businesses around Essex, where I lived. I'd seen their signs on various shops and offices in my town, including at the college where I was studying, which meant this stream was potentially being broadcast from somewhere relatively local to where I was sitting. I took screenshots of the certificate and researched the fire safety company online. They serviced commercial properties throughout Essex and East London, including warehouses, offices, and industrial units. Hundreds of potential locations where someone could set up streaming equipment without attracting attention. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessively researching the local connection, looking at commercial property listings, checking business directories, trying to identify locations that might match what I'd seen in the stream. The man from the stream bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Not just what had obviously happened to him, but the way he'd looked around that room with growing understanding of his situation. The moment when confusion had turned to genuine fear. I considered reporting what I'd seen to the police, but I knew how that would sound. Sixth form student claims to have found evidence of live murder streams based on recognizing a fire safety certificate from a local company. Without more concrete evidence, they dismiss it as internet fantasy. Archive Seeker had mentioned that the operation I'd observed was part of a larger network with multiple locations and regular scheduling. He offered to provide access to additional streams if I was serious about documenting their activities. I should have declined and focused on my A-level coursework instead, but the idea that this might be happening locally had made it feel more urgent and real than just another piece of extreme internet content. The next stream he arranged access to was scheduled for the following weekend. Different location, different setup, but the same basic format. Live violence broadcast to paying audiences who treated real suffering as entertainment. This location was clearer in terms of identifying features, not just a basement, but what appeared to be a converted workshop or garage with distinctive elements that made it easier to place geographically. Most importantly, there was a window visible in the background that showed part of what appeared to be a residential street. Terraced houses with a particular architectural style, streetlights with distinctive lamp designs, road markings that suggested British rather than foreign location. The architectural style looked familiar in a way that made me uncomfortable. Those house designs, the streetlight style, even the particular type of paving stones visible in the road. It all looked very much like areas of Essex I knew well. I spent hours comparing the glimpse of street visible through that window with online maps and street view images of my local area. The match wasn't exact, but it was close enough to suggest the stream was being broadcast from somewhere within about 20 miles of where I lived. The realization that Red Rooms might be operating locally, rather than in some distant country, made everything feel more immediate and dangerous. These weren't abstract criminals in foreign locations. They were people who might live in my area, shop in the same places, use the same roads. I started paying more attention to local news reports, looking for missing person cases that might correspond to victims I'd seen in streams. But without knowing exactly when people had been taken or having clear physical descriptions, it was impossible to make definitive connections. What I did find were several reports of people who disappeared without trace over the past year. Not enough to establish any pattern, but more than you'd normally expect in a relatively small geographic area. One case particularly caught my attention. A man in his 30s been reported missing about 2 months earlier, after failing to return from what should have been a routine evening out. The physical description matched someone I thought I'd seen in one of the archived streams Archive Seeker had shared. The missing person report included a photograph that looked very similar to one of the victims, though the poor video quality made it impossible to be completely certain. But the age, build, and general appearance were consistent enough to be disturbing. I researched the circumstances of his disappearance more thoroughly. He'd left home around 7 p.m. to meet friends at a pub in town, but had never arrived. His car was found the next morning in a supermarket car park about 5 miles away, with no signs of struggle or obvious explanation for why he'd abandoned it there. The location where his car was discovered was interesting because it was near an industrial estate with several empty units that had been vacant for months. the sort of place where someone could operate without being noticed by neighbors or regular foot traffic. I decided to visit the industrial estate, using college work as an excuse to take the bus in that direction. Most of the units were legitimate businesses, small manufacturing, logistics companies, vehicle repair shops, but several were clearly empty, with to-let signs and boarded windows. One unit particularly caught my attention because it had been vacant longer than the others, according to the estate agent's signage, but showed signs of recent activity. Fresh tire tracks in the car park, windows that had been covered from inside rather than just boarded up, electrical connections that suggested power was still connected despite the property being officially empty. From the road, everything looked normal. Just another vacant commercial unit waiting for new tenants. But knowing what I potentially knew about local Red Room operations made it feel sinister in a way that was difficult to explain. I walked past several times over the next week, varying my route and timing to avoid appearing suspicious. Most of the time there was no obvious activity, but occasionally I'd notice vehicles parked outside that weren't there regularly. One evening, I saw light coming from inside the unit, despite it being officially vacant. Not normal commercial lighting, but the harsh, bright illumination that would be needed for filming or streaming. That's when I realized I might be looking at the actual location where some of the streams were being broadcast. I should have contacted the authorities immediately, should have reported my suspicions and let them investigate whether criminal activity was taking place at that address. But I was worried about how my story would sound and whether anyone would take a sixth form student seriously. More importantly, I was concerned about what might happen if the people operating the Red Room discovered that someone had identified their location. They demonstrated willingness to commit serious violence for entertainment. What would they do to protect their operation from exposure? Instead, I decided to gather more evidence before making any reports, document activity at the property, record when lights were visible, note which vehicles visited and when, build a case that would be convincing enough for police to take seriously. But as I was conducting this informal surveillance, I noticed something that changed my approach entirely. One of the regular visitors to the vacant unit was someone I recognized from college. Not a student, but one of the part-time maintenance staff who worked around the buildings and grounds. Someone who had access to areas students didn't normally go, who could move around without attracting attention, who would know which parts of the college were empty at different times. Someone who would have seen me around campus regularly and could easily find out my personal details from college records. The realization that someone from my own college might be involved in Red Room operations made me reconsider everything I thought I knew about the situation. This wasn't just about finding evidence of criminal activity. It was about discovering that someone from my daily environment was potentially involved in torture and murder. I stopped visiting the industrial estate after that realization. If the maintenance worker was involved and had noticed my interest in the vacant unit, then I'd potentially identified myself as someone who knew too much about their activities. The next day at college, I found myself paying attention to the maintenance staff in ways I never had before, watching how they moved around the building, which areas they accessed, whether they showed any unusual interest in particular students or staff members. The worker I'd recognized seemed to be watching me too. Not obviously, but I caught him looking in my direction more often than felt normal, and he seemed to be working in areas near my usual routes, between classes more frequently than before. That evening, I found an envelope that had been slipped under my bedroom door while I was downstairs having dinner with my parents. Inside was a single piece of paper with a printed message that made my hands shake as I read it. Curiosity can be dangerous. No signature, no return address, nothing that would identify who had sent it. But the timing and content made it clear that someone knew about my interest in red rooms and wanted me to stop investigating. I threw the note away and tried to convince myself it was just coincidence or someone playing a prank, but I couldn't stop thinking about how they'd obtained my home address and managed to deliver the message without my parents noticing anything unusual. Over the next few days, I became increasingly paranoid about being watched. Every glance from the maintenance worker at college felt threatening. Every unexpected sound at home made me check the windows and doors, but nothing obvious happened. No more notes, no threatening phone calls, no signs that anyone was following me or monitoring my activities. Just the persistent feeling that someone was paying closer attention to my routine than felt comfortable. I stopped participating in the extreme content forums and tried to focus on my A-level coursework instead. But I couldn't shake the knowledge of what I'd discovered, or the fear that I'd gotten too close to something dangerous. The maintenance worker left the college about 2 weeks later. According to the staff I asked, he'd found better employment elsewhere and given standard notice. Nothing suspicious about the circumstances, just normal staff turnover. But I noticed that the lights stopped appearing in the vacant industrial unit around the same time. I never reported what I'd discovered to the police. The evidence was too circumstantial and the risks too obvious. Instead, I tried to pretend the whole thing had never happened and focus on preparing for university. But I still think about that first stream and the silence that had made it impossible to look away. How the lack of audio had somehow made everything feel more real and immediate than if there had been sound. And I think about how many other similar operations might be running in vacant commercial units and empty buildings across the country, operated by people who work ordinary jobs and live ordinary lives when they're not broadcasting real violence to paying audiences. Silence from the speakers made the stream harder to look away from, but sometimes the most disturbing thing about extreme content isn't what you can see and hear. It's realizing how close it might be to your own everyday world. It only takes one bad click to end up somewhere you never intended to go. And once you're there, getting back out isn't always as simple as closing a browser window. I was working part-time security at an office complex in Nottingham, doing the weekend shifts that nobody else wanted. 12-hour days walking around empty buildings, checking doors that were always locked, watching CCTV screens that never showed anything more interesting than the occasional fox crossing the car park. The pay was decent enough for what it was, but the boredom was crushing. Most of the time, I'd bring books or magazines to help pass the hours, but eventually, you run out of things to read. That's when I started spending more time online, using the free Wi-Fi in the reception area to browse whatever caught my attention. News sites, social media, the usual time-wasting activities that everyone does when they're trying to make 8 hours feel like less than 8 hours. The progression to darker content was gradual. Started with true crime forums, then moved to places where people shared footage of accidents and incidents that mainstream media wouldn't show. Nothing particularly extreme initially, just the sort of material that gets removed from regular platforms for being too graphic or disturbing. But each forum led to recommendations for others, and the content kept getting more intense. Places where people discussed banned documentaries, leaked police footage, material that existed in the grey areas between legal and illegal, the sort of communities that felt like digital speakeasies, hidden from casual browsers but accessible if you knew where to look. One forum I found was dedicated to documenting what they called authentic extreme content. The participants claimed to verify whether violent videos were genuine or staged, approaching it like academic research rather than entertainment. They had detailed discussions about production techniques, geographic indicators, and technical analysis that seemed more professional than you'd expect from random internet users. That's where I first encountered serious discussions about red rooms. For those who don't know, red rooms are supposedly live streams hidden on the dark web where viewers can watch real torture and murder happening in real time. Most people dismiss them as internet mythology, too technically complex and legally risky for anyone to actually operate. But the forum participants had evidence that suggested otherwise. Screenshots of streaming interfaces, recordings of what appeared to be live violence, documentation of hidden services that hosted such content. The material was disturbing enough that I initially assumed it was elaborate fiction created by people with too much time and too much imagination. What made me reconsider was the level of technical detail in their discussions. These weren't teenagers making up stories about urban legends. They spoke about hosting infrastructure, audience management, and content distribution with the sort of expertise that suggested real familiarity rather than speculation. One participant, who went by the username Witness X, claimed to have documented multiple Red Room operations over the past year. He offered to share evidence with people who could demonstrate serious research interest rather than casual curiosity. The verification process involved discussing other extreme content in enough detail to prove you weren't just fishing for sensational material. After several weeks of conversation, Witness X finally shared some of his archive. The files were disturbing but not conclusive. Dark rooms with industrial equipment, bound figures, timestamps suggesting live broadcasts. It could have been sophisticated fiction or genuine documentation of real events. Without seeing the streams themselves, there was no way to make a definitive judgment. Witness X explained that accessing live Red Room streams required more commitment than just viewing recordings. The hidden services changed locations frequently, operated on irregular schedules, and required personal recommendations to access. Not the sort of thing you could stumble across accidentally. But if I was serious about understanding whether Red Rooms were real phenomena or elaborate hoaxes, he could arrange for me to observe a live stream scheduled for the following week. I should have declined. My interest in extreme content was supposed to be about passing time during boring security shifts, not getting involved in potentially illegal activities. But curiosity got the better of me, especially since Witness X assured me that observation didn't require any participation or payment. The access instructions were complex but manageable. Specific software to download, rotating passwords, designated connection times. The whole process felt designed to filter out casual browsers while providing access to people with genuine research interests. When I finally connected to the stream during one of my weekend shifts, the interface was surprisingly ordinary. A video player showing a feed from what appeared to be a basement or converted garage, with a chat window below where viewers could communicate. Nothing sophisticated about the presentation. The video showed a concrete-walled space with harsh lighting and minimal furniture. In the center was a metal table, and strapped to that table was a man who appeared to be in his 30s. He was conscious but not moving much, occasionally testing his restraints or looking around the room with obvious confusion and fear. The chat was active with participants discussing what they expected to see happen. Comments in multiple languages suggested an international audience, though English appeared to be the primary language for communication. People were making suggestions, placing bets on various outcomes, treating the situation like interactive entertainment. I watched for about 40 minutes while continuing my security rounds, checking the stream whenever I returned to the reception desk. The man on the table would periodically struggle against his restraints or attempt to speak, though no audio was available. The chat maintained running commentary, with participants displaying varying levels of enthusiasm for what was clearly going to be genuine violence. Around midnight, someone entered the frame. They were dressed casually. Jeans, dark hoodie, regular trainers. Nothing theatrical about their appearance, no mask or costume. Just someone who could have been anyone, preparing to do something that definitely wasn't ordinary. The figure moved around the space methodically, arranging tools on a nearby surface, adjusting camera equipment, checking various pieces of apparatus that weren't fully visible in the main video feed. They worked with practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first time following this routine. The chat became more excited as preparations continued. People were making specific requests, sharing experiences from previous streams, discussing what they hoped to see happen. The viewer counter showed several hundred people watching the stream. About 15 minutes into the preparations, I noticed something that made me stop mid-patrol and stare at the screen more carefully. In the background of the video, partially visible through what appeared to be a doorway, was a section of distinctive brick wall. Not the concrete walls of the main room, but older-looking brickwork with a particular pattern and color that seemed familiar. I recognized that brickwork because I'd been looking at it every weekend for the past 6 months. It was identical to the external walls of the office complex where I worked security. A building that had been constructed in the 1960s with a specific type of brick that wasn't common in modern construction, which meant this stream was being broadcast from somewhere very close to where I was sitting. I left the reception desk and did a more thorough patrol of the building than usual, paying particular attention to areas I normally just walked past quickly. The office complex consisted of 3 connected buildings around a central courtyard, with various storage areas, maintenance rooms, and basement spaces that I rarely had reason to visit. In the basement of the oldest building, I found a door that was usually locked but was now slightly ajar. Beyond it was a staircase leading to a sub-basement level that I'd never explored, assuming it was just additional storage or building services. The staircase led to a corridor with several rooms branching off it. Most were filled with old office furniture and equipment, but one door was closed and had light visible around the edges. I should have called the police immediately, should have gone back upstairs and reported what I'd discovered to the authorities. Instead, I found myself approaching the door to confirm what I already suspected I'd find. Through a gap in the door frame, I could see the same concrete-walled room I'd been watching on the stream. The same harsh lighting, the same metal table, the same figure in the hoodie making final preparations for whatever they were planning to do, and the same man strapped to the table, who I now realized was in the basement of the building where I was supposed to be providing security. The live stream I'd been watching was happening directly below me, being broadcast to hundreds of viewers who had no idea they were watching events unfold in a Nottingham office complex. I backed away from the door and made it halfway up the stairs before I heard footsteps in the corridor behind me. Someone had heard me moving around and was coming to investigate. I reached the main basement level and tried to make it look like I was conducting a routine security check, but I could hear the person from the sub-basement following me up the stairs. When I turned around, it was the figure from the stream, still wearing the same hoodie, but now I could see their face clearly. Someone who looked completely ordinary. Could have been anyone you might pass on the street without giving them a second glance. They asked what I was doing in the basement, and I explained that I was the security guard conducting routine patrols. They seemed to accept this explanation, mentioning that they were doing some maintenance work downstairs and apologizing if they'd left any doors unlocked. The conversation was perfectly polite and normal, except for the context of what I knew they'd been preparing to do in that concrete room. They walked back towards the sub-basement, and I continued my patrol as if nothing had happened. But I could hear them moving around downstairs, and I knew that whatever had been planned for the live stream was either being postponed or relocated. I finished my shift and left the building at the normal time, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd discovered. Someone was using the office complex to create Red Room content, broadcasting real violence to paying audiences, and I was the only person who knew about it. The logical action was to contact the police with what I'd witnessed, but explaining how I discovered it would require admitting to accessing illegal content online, and I wasn't sure they'd believe such a bizarre story anyway. More importantly, I was worried about what might happen if the people running the operation realized I knew about their activities. They'd seen me in the building, knew I worked there regularly, could easily find out my personal details from the security company records. Over the next few days, I researched whether there had been any missing person reports that might correspond to the man I'd seen in the stream. But without knowing when he'd been taken or where from, it was impossible to identify any specific cases. I also started paying more attention to the other people who had access to the office complex: maintenance staff, cleaning crews, building management personnel, anyone who might have keys to areas that weren't normally accessible to security guards. The building management company had records of various contractors who'd worked in the basement areas over the past year. Electrical upgrades, plumbing repairs, installation of additional cabling for internet infrastructure. Any of these projects could have provided cover for someone to set up equipment in the sub-basement without attracting attention. One contractor particularly caught my interest, a small company that had done extensive electrical work throughout the basement levels, installing new power circuits and data connections, the sort of infrastructure improvements that would be necessary for running high-bandwidth streaming equipment. I looked up the company online and found that it was registered to an address that didn't seem to exist. The phone number went to voicemail. The website looked professional, but contained no useful contact information, and there were no customer reviews or business listings that suggested genuine trading activity, which meant either the company was a front for illegal activities, or someone had used fake credentials to gain access to the building for legitimate work that had nothing to do with the Red Rooms. The next weekend, I did a more thorough exploration of the sub-basement during my shift. The concrete room was empty now, but there was clear evidence of recent use. Power cables, camera mounting points, network connections that hadn't been there during the building's original construction. Someone had spent considerable time and money converting that space into a professional streaming facility, and they'd done it without the building owners apparently knowing anything about it. I found other evidence too. A schedule pinned to the wall showing dates and times over the next several weeks. Equipment lists that suggested multiple cameras and professional lighting. Contact details for what appeared to be other locations, possibly part of a larger operation. And most disturbing of all, a folder containing photographs and personal information about various individuals. Names, addresses, daily routines, the sort of detailed surveillance data that would be used for targeting potential victims. I photographed everything I could find and then left the area undisturbed. If this was an ongoing operation rather than a one-off event, there would be more activity in the coming weeks that I could document and report to the authorities. But as I was leaving the sub-basement, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Among the photographs in the folder was one of me. Not a recent photo, but one that had clearly been taken during one of my security patrols over the past few months. The image showed me checking doors in the main building, completely unaware that I was being observed and documented, which meant the people operating the Red Room knew exactly who I was, where I worked, and probably where I lived. I left the building immediately and spent the rest of the weekend trying to decide what to do. Going to the police would provide some protection, but it would also confirm to the operators that I'd discovered their activities and was willing to report them. Not going to the police meant allowing the operation to continue, potentially putting other people at risk, but might keep me safer if they believed I hadn't seen anything significant. In the end, I called in sick on Monday and sent an anonymous tip to the police about suspicious activity in the office complex basement. I provided enough details to justify a thorough search without revealing how I'd obtained the information. The next day, local news reported that police had discovered what they described as sophisticated criminal operation in a Nottingham office building. 3 people were arrested and various equipment was seized, but no details were provided about what exactly had been found. I never went back to that security job. Told the company I'd found other employment and needed to finish immediately. They weren't particularly bothered. Part-time security guards are easy to replace. But I still think about that concrete room and the casual way the person in the hoodie had spoken to me after I'd interrupted their preparations. How ordinary they'd seemed, despite what they were planning to do. And I think about that photograph of me in the folder, and whether there might be other security guards or maintenance workers in other buildings who've stumbled across similar operations without realizing what they'd found. Imagine being 15 and desperate enough to impress someone that you pretend to know about things you'd only read about in forum posts, until pretending becomes something much more dangerous than you ever intended. I was in year 11 at a comprehensive in Manchester when I started chatting with someone who seemed infinitely cooler than anyone I knew in real life. She went by the username Dark Explorer and claimed to be 18, studying media at university, with access to parts of the internet that most people never discovered. We'd met in a forum dedicated to discussing banned films and censored content, where she posted detailed reviews of documentaries and footage that had been pulled from mainstream platforms. Her knowledge seemed encyclopedic. She could discuss technical aspects of film production, legal issues around content distribution, and historical context for material that I'd barely heard of. I was immediately intimidated and fascinated. Here was someone who seemed to understand the internet's hidden corners in ways that made my own browsing habits feel childish and superficial. I wanted to seem equally knowledgeable, equally sophisticated in my interests, so I started exaggerating. When she mentioned underground streaming sites, I claimed to have accessed them. When she discussed extreme content that existed in legal grey areas, I pretended to have seen it. When she referenced technical concepts I didn't understand, I nodded along and tried to contribute insights that made me sound more experienced than I actually was. The lies started small, but escalated quickly as our conversations continued. She seemed impressed by my apparent knowledge, which encouraged me to embellish further. I created stories about content I'd supposedly discovered, shared fictional accounts of browsing sessions that had never happened, built an entire persona around being someone far more worldly than a 15-year-old from suburban Manchester actually was. After about 2 months of increasingly elaborate fabrications, Dark Explorer mentioned something that made me panic about maintaining my false image. Red rooms, She brought them up casually, as if they were just another type of content she'd encountered during her explorations of hidden sites. Live streams where viewers could watch real violence happening in real time, broadcast from various locations on the dark web. Most people dismissed red rooms as urban legends, she explained, but anyone who'd spent serious time exploring the internet's darker regions knew they existed. The technical barriers weren't as insurmountable as skeptics claimed, and there was clearly sufficient demand to make them economically viable. I should have admitted ignorance at that point, should have explained that I'd heard of red rooms but never actually encountered one. Instead, I found myself claiming not only to have seen them, but to have opinions about their authenticity and technical implementation. Dark Explorer seemed intrigued by my supposed expertise. She asked detailed questions about specific aspects of Red Room streams, video quality, interface design, audience interaction methods, questions that made it clear she expected me to have first-hand knowledge rather than theoretical understanding. I improvised answers based on things I'd read in forum discussions, trying to sound authoritative while hoping she wouldn't notice the gaps in my knowledge. The conversation felt like a test I was barely passing, with each question pushing me further into territory I didn't actually understand. After that discussion, I spent hours researching red rooms online, trying to learn enough to maintain the facade I'd created. Most of what I found was obviously fictional or second-hand speculation, but a few sources seemed to have genuine knowledge about accessing hidden streaming sites. The research was supposed to be about covering my lies, but I found myself genuinely curious about whether red rooms actually existed. If Dark Explorer was right about them being real phenomena rather than internet mythology, then documenting them would provide the sort of exclusive knowledge that would cement my reputation as someone worth knowing. I started exploring parts of the internet I'd never visited before, following leads from the more credible sources I'd discovered. The process was more complex than I'd expected, involving software I'd never used and sites that required specific access methods. After about a week of persistent searching, I found something that looked promising. A site hosting what appeared to be live streams from various hidden locations. The interface was basic but functional, with video players showing feeds from different rooms. Most showed empty spaces or static scenes, but a few had activity that suggested they were genuinely live. One stream showed what appeared to be a basement or converted garage with someone strapped to a metal table. The video quality was poor and there was no audio, but the timestamp suggested it was happening in real time, rather than being pre-recorded content. I watched for about an hour, telling myself I was conducting research rather than witnessing something genuinely disturbing. The person on the table would occasionally move or struggle against their restraints, but mostly just lay there with the resigned expression of someone who understood their situation. Around 10 p.m., someone entered the frame and began making preparations that suggested the stream was about to become considerably more disturbing than passive observation of a restrained person. I should have closed the browser at that point and pretended I'd never found the site. Instead, I took screenshots and saved details about how to access the stream, thinking this would provide evidence to share with Dark Explorer that would prove my claimed expertise was genuine. The next day, I messaged her with carefully edited details about what I'd supposedly discovered. I described the site and its content in ways that demonstrated I'd actually accessed it, while avoiding specifics that might reveal how recently I'd found it, or how little I actually understood about what I was seeing. Dark Explorer seemed impressed but also concerned. She pointed out that witnessing real violence, even passively through online streams, could have legal implications that I might not have considered. She suggested I be more careful about what I accessed and how I documented it. Her concern felt genuine in ways that made me realize she might actually care about my well-being, rather than just being impressed by my supposed knowledge. For the first time since we'd started chatting, I considered telling her the truth about how inexperienced I actually was. But I was too invested in the persona I'd created to back down now. Instead, I assured her that I was being careful and knew what I was doing, while privately resolving to be more cautious about what I accessed online. Except I kept going back to the streaming site. Not because I enjoyed watching disturbing content, but because I'd become fascinated by the technical aspects of how it functioned. The site seemed to host multiple streams from different locations, suggesting either a single person with access to various properties or multiple people contributing content to a shared platform. The streams I'd initially found were replaced by new ones every few days, always showing different rooms and different victims. The production quality varied considerably, from professional setups with multiple camera angles to amateur recordings from single static positions. What disturbed me most wasn't the violence itself, but the mundane details that suggested these streams were being produced locally rather than in distant countries. Background sounds that seemed typically British, architectural details that looked familiar, even glimpses of packaging or signage that suggested UK origins. The possibility that red rooms were being produced somewhere near Manchester, rather than in abstract foreign locations, made everything feel more immediate and dangerous. These weren't distant criminals operating in places I'd never visit. They could be people who lived in my area, used the same shops, traveled the same roads. I started paying attention to local news reports, looking for missing person cases that might correspond to victims I'd seen in streams. Without clear physical descriptions or specific dates, it was impossible to make definitive connections, but there seemed to be more unexplained disappearances than you'd normally expect. One case particularly bothered me because the missing person was around my own age, a 16-year-old who'd been reported missing about 2 months earlier after failing to return home from college. The circumstances were unusual because there had been no obvious reason for them to disappear voluntarily. I researched the case more thoroughly and found that the missing person had lived in an area of Manchester I was familiar with. They disappeared while walking home along a route that passed through several areas where someone could be intercepted without witnesses. The possibility that someone my own age from my own city might have become a victim in the streams I'd been watching made everything feel personal in ways I hadn't expected. This wasn't just about impressing someone online or maintaining a false persona. It was about real people suffering for reasons I didn't understand. I considered reporting what I'd discovered to the police, but I knew how that conversation would sound. 15-year-old claims to have found evidence of live murder streams while trying to impress someone online. They'd probably assume I was making up stories for attention. More importantly, I was worried about what might happen if the people behind the streams discovered that someone had identified their activities. I'd been accessing their content for weeks, potentially leaving digital traces that could be used to identify me. Dark Explorer had mentioned that serious exploration of hidden sites required understanding how to protect your identity and location from people who might not appreciate unwanted attention. Knowledge I clearly didn't possess, despite claiming to be experienced with this type of browsing. I decided to be more honest with her about my actual level of expertise, hoping she might provide guidance about staying safe online while continuing to access unusual content. But when I tried to message her, I discovered that her account had been deleted. Not just inactive or abandoned, but completely removed from the forum where we'd met. Her previous posts were gone. Her username was available for new registration, and there was no indication that Dark Explorer had ever existed. I checked other platforms where we'd occasionally communicated, but found the same thing. Every trace of our conversations had been eliminated, as if someone had systematically removed all evidence of our interaction. The sudden disappearance felt ominous in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Either Dark Explorer had decided to completely reinvent her online identity for reasons I didn't understand, or something had happened that required eliminating her digital presence entirely. I stopped accessing the streaming site after that, telling myself I'd learned enough to satisfy my curiosity and prove my claimed expertise to myself, if not to anyone else. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd gotten involved in something more serious than I'd initially understood. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small things that individually meant nothing but collectively made me uncomfortable. Post delivered later than usual. Items in my room that seemed to have been moved slightly. Sounds outside my bedroom window that could have been coincidence, but felt like surveillance. The sort of details that could easily be imagination or paranoia, but which felt more significant in the context of my growing concern that I'd attracted unwanted attention through my online activities. One evening, I found an envelope that had been slipped under my bedroom door while I was downstairs having dinner with my parents. Inside was a single photograph that made my hands shake as I looked at it. The photograph showed me walking to college, taken from a concealed position that suggested professional surveillance rather than casual observation. Someone had been watching me closely enough to document my daily routine without me noticing anything unusual. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten message that made it clear this wasn't a random incident. Stop pretending. No signature, no explanation. Just those two words that referenced the fundamental dishonesty that had led me into this situation. Someone knew I'd been fabricating knowledge about things I didn't understand, and they'd apparently been monitoring my activities closely enough to document my real-world movements. I threw the photograph away and tried to convince myself it was a prank or coincidence, but I couldn't explain how someone had obtained my home address or managed to deliver the message without my parents noticing anything unusual. Over the next few days, I became increasingly paranoid about being watched. Every stranger I saw near my house felt threatening. Every unexpected sound made me check the windows and doors. But nothing obvious happened. No more photographs, no threatening phone calls, no signs that anyone was following me or monitoring my activities. Just the persistent feeling that someone knew more about my daily routine than they should. I never tried to contact Dark Explorer again or access any more hidden streaming sites. The whole experience had taught me that pretending to knowledge I didn't possess could lead to consequences I wasn't prepared to handle. But I still think about that photograph and the casual way someone had documented my movements without me noticing anything unusual. How long they might have been watching me before deciding to reveal their surveillance. And I think about Dark Explorer and whether she'd been real at all, or just part of an elaborate process designed to draw people like me into situations they didn't understand. Whether other people had received similar guidance and encouragement to explore content they weren't equipped to handle safely. Sometimes I wonder if the whole thing had been a game from the beginning, just not the kind of game I'd thought I was playing. Whether my attempts to impress someone online had made me a target for people who were considerably more experienced at manipulation than I was at detecting it. Late-night browsing has a way of making everything feel less real. especially when you're stuck indoors with nothing but painkillers and time to kill. I'd been laid up for about 3 weeks after having my appendix out. One of those emergency surgeries that goes from feeling fine in the morning to being wheeled into theatre by evening. The operation went smoothly enough, but the recovery was taking longer than expected, and I was getting proper cabin fever being stuck in my flat in Brighton, with nothing to do but watch television and scroll through my phone. The first week was bearable. Plenty of people visiting, get well cards to read, catching up on shows I'd been meaning to watch. But by the second week, the novelty had worn off, and I was getting restless. My sick pay was covering the basics, but there wasn't much money for entertainment, so I was spending more time online than usual just to have something to occupy my mind. It started with the usual social media time wasting, then moved to forums and discussion boards I'd never bothered exploring before. True crime communities, conspiracy theory groups, places where people shared unusual content that you wouldn't find on mainstream platforms. Nothing particularly extreme initially, just the sort of rabbit holes you fall down when you've got too much time and not enough to do. One forum I discovered was dedicated to investigating internet mysteries and urban legends. The participants took a scientific approach to debunking hoaxes and documenting genuine phenomena, treating it like collaborative research rather than entertainment. They had ongoing investigations into everything from viral videos to disappeared websites. That's where I first encountered detailed discussions about red rooms. The basic concept was straightforward enough. Live streams supposedly hidden on the dark web where viewers could watch real violence and murder happening in real time. Most participants dismissed them as technically unfeasible and economically unviable, but a few claim to have encountered evidence suggesting they might actually exist. The discussions were more academic than sensational. People analyzed the technical requirements for hosting live violent content, discussed the legal and practical barriers to maintaining such operations, debated whether the demand was sufficient to justify the risks involved. What made me pay attention was how knowledgeable some participants seemed about the hidden parts of the internet. They discussed hosting infrastructure and content distribution with the sort of expertise that suggested real familiarity rather than theoretical speculation. One participant, who went by Document Keeper, claimed to have archived material from what appeared to be genuine Red Room streams. He was cautious about sharing details, requiring people to demonstrate serious research interest rather than morbid curiosity before he'd provide access to his collection. The verification process involved discussing other extreme content in enough detail to prove you weren't just fishing for sensational material. After about 2 weeks of conversation, Document Keeper finally shared some screenshots and video clips from his archive. The material was disturbing, but not conclusive. Dark rooms with industrial equipment, restrained figures, interface elements that suggested live streaming. It could have been elaborate fiction, created by someone with considerable technical skills, or genuine documentation of real events. What struck me as potentially authentic was the mundane details that would be easy to overlook if you were creating hoaxes. Background sounds that suggested specific environments, equipment brands visible in some shots, timestamps that corresponded to real dates when cross-referenced with other sources. Document Keeper explained that accessing live Red Room streams required more than just knowing where to look. The hidden services changed locations frequently, operated on irregular schedules, and required personal recommendations from existing participants, not something you could stumble across accidentally. But if I was genuinely interested in documenting whether Red Rooms were real or fictional, he could potentially arrange for me to observe a live stream that was scheduled for later that week. I should have declined at that point. My interest in extreme content was supposed to be about passing time during recovery, not getting involved in potentially illegal activities. But being stuck indoors for weeks had left me desperate for anything that felt engaging and immediate. The access instructions were complex but manageable. Specific software downloads, rotating passwords, designated connection times. The whole system felt designed to filter out casual browsers while providing access to people with genuine research purposes. When I finally connected to the stream, the interface was disappointingly ordinary. A video player embedded in a basic web page, chat window below, viewer counter showing about 200 people online. Nothing sophisticated about the presentation. The video showed what appeared to be a converted basement or garage space. Concrete walls, harsh fluorescent lighting, minimal furniture except for a metal table positioned in the center of the frame. The atmosphere was industrial rather than domestic. Strapped to the table was a woman who appeared to be in her 20s, conscious but not moving much. She would occasionally test her restraints or look around the room, but mostly just lay there with the resigned expression of someone who understood their situation but had stopped fighting against it. The chat was active with comments in multiple languages, people discussing what they wanted to see happen, making suggestions, treating the whole situation like interactive entertainment. The international nature of the audience was clear from the variety of languages being used. I watched for about an hour while taking my evening medication, using the laptop propped up on my bed. The woman would periodically struggle against the restraints or attempt to speak, though no audio was available through the stream. The chat maintained running commentary, with participants displaying varying levels of enthusiasm for what was clearly going to be genuine violence. Around 11 p.m., someone entered the frame. They were dressed casually, jeans, plain shirt, regular shoes. Nothing theatrical about their appearance, no mask or costume. Just someone who looked like they could be starting any ordinary job, except for what they were obviously planning to do. The figure moved around the space with practiced efficiency, arranging tools on a nearby surface, adjusting camera angles, checking equipment that wasn't visible in the main video feed. They worked with the methodical approach of someone following a familiar routine. The chat became more excited as preparations continued. People were making specific requests, sharing experiences from previous streams, discussing what they hoped to see happen. The viewer count had climbed to over 300. About 15 minutes into the preparations, I noticed something that made me pause the stream and look more carefully at the background details. On the wall behind the table was a small window positioned high up near the ceiling. Through that window, I could see a section of what appeared to be a residential street, terraced houses with distinctive Victorian architecture, a street light with a particular style of lampshade, a road sign that was partially visible. The architectural style looked familiar in a way that made me uncomfortable. Those terraced houses, that street light design, even the particular shade of brick used in the construction. It all looked very much like my own neighborhood in Brighton. I minimized the stream and opened a mapping application on my phone, comparing the street view images of my area with what I'd seen through that basement window. The match wasn't exact, but it was close enough to suggest the stream was being broadcast from somewhere relatively local. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessively researching the Brighton connection, looking at property records for houses with basements, checking planning applications for building modifications, trying to identify locations that might match what I'd seen in the stream. The woman from the stream had bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Not just the violence she was obviously going to suffer, but the way she'd looked resigned rather than terrified. as if she understood exactly what was going to happen and had given up trying to prevent it. I considered contacting the police, but I knew how that conversation would sound. Someone recovering from surgery claims to have found evidence of live murder streams based on recognizing local architecture through a basement window. Without more concrete evidence, I'd just be wasting their time. Instead, I decided to research missing person reports for the Brighton area, looking for cases that might correspond to the woman I'd seen in the stream, but without knowing when she'd been taken or her physical description beyond what was visible in poor lighting. It was impossible to identify any specific cases. Document Keeper had mentioned that the operation I'd observed was part of a larger network with multiple locations and regular scheduling. He offered to provide access to additional streams if I was serious about documenting their activities. I should have declined and tried to forget the whole thing. But being stuck indoors with nothing but recovery time had left me with an unhealthy level of curiosity about things I shouldn't be investigating. The next stream he arranged access to was scheduled for the following weekend. Different location, different setup, but the same basic format. Live violence broadcast to paying audiences who treated real suffering as entertainment. This time the location was clearer. Not just a basement, but what appeared to be a converted garage or workshop with distinctive features that made it easier to identify. Industrial shelving along one wall, a particular type of concrete flooring, electrical installations that looked like commercial rather than residential work, and most importantly, a calendar on the wall from a local business in Hove. I recognized the business name because I'd used their services about 6 months earlier when I'd needed some electrical work done in my flat. A small company that specialized in domestic and light commercial installations, the sort of local tradesman you'd find through recommendations rather than online advertising. The calendar was current year but showed several months ago, suggesting the location had been in use for an extended period, rather than being set up specifically for streaming. Someone had been operating from this converted garage for at least several months. I spent the rest of the weekend researching the electrical company and their previous customers. Their website showed they'd worked on various residential and commercial properties throughout Brighton and Hove, including several garage conversions and workshop installations. One project particularly caught my attention. A garage conversion in Hove that had been completed about 8 months earlier, transforming a standard residential garage into what was described as a home workshop. The sort of project that would require extensive electrical work and might provide cover for installing equipment that wasn't related to traditional workshop activities. The property was registered to someone whose name didn't appear in any obvious online searches. No social media profiles, no business listings, no public records beyond the basic property ownership information. Either someone who was extremely private or someone who was deliberately maintaining a low profile. I decided to take a walk past the property, using my recovery as an excuse to get some gentle exercise outside the flat. The house was in a quiet residential street, about 20 minutes from where I lived, unremarkable except for the recently renovated garage that had been converted with new electrical installations and what appeared to be sound insulation. From the street, everything looked completely normal. Just another terraced house with a converted garage, the sort of home improvement project that happens all over Brighton every year. But knowing what I potentially knew about how that space was being used made it feel sinister in a way that was difficult to explain. I walked past several times over the next few days, varying my route and timing to avoid looking suspicious. Most of the time, there was no activity, but occasionally I'd see cars parked outside that weren't there regularly, suggesting visitors who didn't live at the property. One evening, I noticed that the garage had light visible around the edges of what appeared to be blackout curtains or covers over the windows. Not workshop lighting, but the harsh, bright illumination that would be needed for filming. That's when I realized I might be looking at the actual location where the Red Room streams were being broadcast. I should have contacted the authorities immediately. Should have reported my suspicions and let them investigate whether criminal activity was taking place at that address. But I was worried about how my story would sound and whether I'd be taken seriously. More importantly, I was concerned about what might happen if the people operating the Red Room discovered that someone had identified their location. They demonstrated they were willing to commit serious violence for the entertainment of paying audiences. What would they do to protect their operation from exposure? Instead, I decided to gather more evidence before making any reports. Document the activity at the property, record when lights were on in the garage, note which vehicles visited and when. Build a case that would be convincing enough for police to take seriously. But as I was conducting this informal surveillance, I noticed something that made me reconsider my approach. One of the regular visitors to the property was driving a van from the electrical company, whose calendar I'd seen in the stream. The same local business that had done work on my flat 6 months earlier, which meant they had my address, knew where I lived, and possibly had records of when I'd be at home recovering from surgery. I stopped walking past the property after that realization. If the electrical company was involved in the Red Room operation, then they potentially knew I was taking an unusual interest in one of their clients' properties, and they had access to personal information that would make it easy to find me. The next day, I received a get well card in the post. Nothing unusual about that. People had been sending cards throughout my recovery. But this one was different. No return address, generic message inside, and a photograph tucked behind the card. The photograph showed me walking past the house in Hove. Not a casual snapshot, but a deliberate surveillance image taken with a proper camera from a concealed position. Someone had been watching me watching them, documenting my interest in their property. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten note with just a few words that made it clear this wasn't a friendly gesture. Recovery going well? I threw the card away immediately and spent the rest of the day checking that my flat was properly secured. But I couldn't stop thinking about how they'd obtained my address and how long they might have been monitoring my activities. That evening, I noticed a car parked outside my building that I hadn't seen before. Nothing particularly suspicious about it, just an ordinary family saloon with local plates. But it was positioned where the driver would have a clear view of my windows. The car was gone the next morning, but I found myself checking for it every time I looked outside, and checking behind me when I walked to the local shops for groceries, and sleeping with furniture pushed against my bedroom door. I never reported what I'd discovered to the police. The evidence was too circumstantial and the risks too obvious. Instead, I tried to pretend the whole thing had never happened and focus on completing my recovery. But I still think about that woman in the first stream and the resigned way she'd looked around that concrete room. Whether she'd known she was being watched by hundreds of people who were paying to see her suffer. And I think about how many other similar operations might be running in converted garages and basement workshops across the country, operated by people who look like ordinary tradesmen and business people. Late-night browsing has a way of making everything feel less real, until you discover that some of the most disturbing content online is being produced much closer to home than you ever imagined.